Good afternoon, and welcome to this symposium, the last event in the 30th anniversary of Armenian Studies at the University of Michigan. The symposium named Armenia in World History and the World in Armenian History. We have really a wonderful selection, a kind of showcase for you of all of our students that we have produced, well, not all of them, but some of the highlights of them in the last 30 years, mostly our own students, except for one exception, but we definitely claim him, and that is Sebouh Aslanian, because he got a postdoc here, and that, of course, launched his career. So I will start off just by giving you a little bit of a background. You have a bibliography, so I don't need to go into details. What I can promise you is that we're going to go as far as temporality. We're going to start with a panel on the medieval and the early modern period, and we'll move then to mostly the early modern and the modern period. Even though this is a linear progression, more or less, you will see that our speakers will break with this linearity and really present you with new paradigms and frames of looking at Armenian history and placing Armenian history in larger historiography. So the first section here is on world history itself. We have two already very prominent scholars in the field. We'll start off with Sebouh Aslanian, who will speak for you for 50 minutes because he's going to set the stage of this processes and historicity of Armenian studies within a larger frame of historiography as well. And then we will move to Stephen Rapp, but I'll begin by introducing Sebouh Aslanian, who graduated in 2007 from Columbia University, himself really a product, I think, of an area studies program that didn't necessarily have an Armenian specialist who taught him, which I think tells you something about the kind of breadth and creativity that Sebouh encompasses in the way in which he understands early modern Armenian history. His award-winning dissertation, but as well an award-winning book, From the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean, the Global Trade Networks of Armenian Merchants from New Julfa, really put a different perspective onto the way in which we understand New Julfans, in particular in Esfahan in the early modern period. And most recently, I think 2011 has been a wonderful year for Sebouh. I hope many more years of the like to come. He was nominated the PEN USA Literary Award, the UC California Press Exceptional First Book winner. So without further ado, please let's welcome Sebouh Aslanian.
Well, thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you all for being here. Today's paper is very much still a work in progress, although I would be lying if I said that I just wrote a draft and finished it last night. It's been sort of a work in progress for for more than a year. And what I've tried to do is I've tried to drastically cut down and distill a 50-page paper into a 25-page paper so I could actually meet the time limits that all of us have to abide by. And I hope that in the process of doing this, I haven't left out important elements, or if I have, I would be more than happy to address them if you have any questions later on. I also want to thank, obviously, the Michigan program because, as Catherine stated, and she wasn't exaggerating in the least bit, the year I did spend here was a year which made a lot of my small accomplishments possible. The book that I've just published would not have been possible without the year of interacting with very, very intelligent and collegial colleagues as well as smart students, and having the time to revise my dissertation and transform it into a book. So I'm very grateful for that, and it's nice to be back here again. All right, so in recent decades, world historians have moved away from more conventional studies of nations and national states to examine the role of transregional networks in facilitating hemispheric interactions and connectedness between cultures and regions. This shift from what may be called the optic of the nation state to a global optic has enabled historians to examine large-scale processes of cross-cultural, biological, and economic exchanges unfolding across vast bodies of land and water, and has yielded a growing corpus of scholarly literature on different hemispheric regions, including Greater Eurasia, and even maritime regions of interactivity, such as the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian and Atlantic Oceans. Yes. The emphasis in the new subdiscipline of world history has rested first on the downplaying of the role of nation states and their territorially defined national communities, whose histories, for the most part, have been studied as autonomous histories. And second, on interactive histories that take into account, quote, the complex interplays between different layers of the analysis, that is to say, the local, the regional, the interregional, the national, the continental, and the global, unquote. Similar to interactive histories, a third approach has focused on what Sanjay Subramaniam, building on the work of Joseph Fletcher, has called connected histories, or histories that are characterized by the circulation of ideas and mental constructs across political boundaries and cultural zones. In his study of early modern Eurasia, Subramaniam demonstrates that what seem to be closed cultural zones from a nationalist or area studies perspective are in fact porous and connected to each other in complex ways that generally elude scholars influenced by nationalism, area studies, or even comparative history. What connects these cultural zones, or the local to the global, as Subramaniam suggests, are networks of circulation and transmission, not merely of merchants and commodities, which have received the lion's share of the scholarly attention to date, but also of cultural elites, ideas, and mental constructs. Despite the proliferation of the interactive approach of world history across campuses in North America and Europe, Armenian studies scholars have not thus far demonstrated serious interest in or awareness of the methodological perspectives elaborated by world historians and their colleagues in the cognate field of connected histories, in exploring the rich and complex past of the Armenians. On the whole, the field of Armenian studies has remained rather insular and reluctant to engage in constructive self-criticism. There has not been substantive or significant change in its approach since our very own Ron Sunni wrote the following lines about 15 years ago, and I quote from his book, quote, often directed towards an ethnic rather than a broader international or scholarly audience, Armenian historical writing has been narrowly concerned with fostering a positive image of an endangered nationality. Popular writers and activist journalists, both in the diaspora and in Armenia, handed down an uncritical historical tradition replete with heroes and villains and scholars who might otherwise have enriched the national historiography, withdrew from a field marked by unexamined nationalism and narcissism. Criticism has been avoided as if it might aid ever-present enemies, and certain kinds of inquiry have been shunned as potential betrayals of the national cause, unquote. The kind of scholarship suggested by world historians, one that is cognizant of cross-cultural interactions and sensitive to connected histories of cultures and regions, and the circulation of elites and cultural forms across vast areas that nonetheless leave their socio-cultural traces or deposits in cultures that are otherwise studied in isolation and insulation, have been largely absent in the way Armenian scholars have studied the Armenian past. An unwillingness or inability to contextualize the study of the Armenian pasts in an interactive framework has resulted in the development of a field characterized by high levels of insularity and by perspectives on Armenian history seen largely as autonomous and standing apart from other histories and peoples instead of creatively interacting with them. What follows now is a set of provisional reflections on the writing of Armenian history and to a lesser extent on the field of Armenian studies that builds upon past discussions but also adds a new level or layer of analysis informed by recent scholarship done in the burgeoning field of world or global history. And for me, both of them are actually they're synonymous. They both basically do the same things, world and global. My reflections below are not meant to be definitive statements. Rather, they are invitations to further debate and exploration. So I will begin with a very brief section on the rise of the new world history, so most of us will have a general idea of what world history actually means. Contrary to common misconception, world history is not the history of the world. Rather, as one of its most well-known practitioners, Jerry Bentley, suggests, the new world history, quote, refers to scholarship that explicitly compares experiences across boundary lines of societies, or that examines interactions between peoples of different societies, unquote. Most world history scholarship over the last few decades has often involved focus on what David Christian calls networks of exchange that are transregional, hemispheric, or global in scope. Topics that have engaged the attention of world historians have included 1. The study of long-distance trade and the role of diasporic groups as cross-cultural go-betweens, which is basically what my first book is about, to a large extent. 2. The expansion and consolidation of empires across the world and the proliferation of imperial, missionary, and mercantile networks connecting different regions and cultures into an increasingly global web, thus paving way for globalization in quotation marks. 3. The mass migration of peoples across vast spaces, most notably that of African slavery and the making of the transatlantic world. 4. Biological diffusions and the exchange of diseases and pathogens on a global or hemispheric scale that results from cross-cultural encounters and imperial expansion, as is the case with the Columbian exchange and the spread of the Black Plague in the wake of the Pax Mongolica in Eurasia. And 5. The Great Divergence and the rise of the West in relation to China and other parts of the world, in other parts of the world. As the above sampling of themes common in the work of world historians demonstrates, the leitmotif of such work is focus on large-scale processes involving cross-cultural encounters, interactions, and comparisons between and among societies on a global scale. In some sense, credit for making the study of such large-scale processes integral to the work of professional historians is due to the generation of historians that came of age in the 1960s and 1970s and included such pioneers of the field as Marshall G.S. Hodgson, Lefton Stavrianos, Philip D. Curtin, and especially William H. McNeill, who's happily alive and kicking still today. He's 92 years old. I heard that recently that he was at a conference. However, the field only rose to prominence in North America beginning in the 1980s and the 1990s. It acquired institutional backing with the establishment in 1982 of the World Historical Association as a sub-branch of the American Historical Association, and especially with the creation of its flagship journal, the Journal of World History, in 1990, based in Hawaii, and its European counterpart, the Journal of Global History, based in London and established in 2006. In the United States, world history has since become a central component in teaching in departments of history across many campuses, becoming even a mandatory part of the history curriculum in the state of California, where it has largely replaced the standard conventional staple of Western civilizational courses, or basically what I call from Plato to NATO kind of courses. And this is obviously a good thing for people like myself, because it ensures that there is a constant demand for world historians and usually the availability of jobs in California. As a number of world historians have already noted, the field can perhaps be best understood as a reaction to two ideological assumptions that the discipline of history acquired almost as a birthmark when it became professionalized and university-based in the middle of the 19th century. The first birthmark is the Eurocentric legacy of 19th century imperialism that saw European history and Europe as the site of genuine historical development, as opposed to other regions that they consider to be stagnant and unchanging, and therefore not worthy of being studied by professional historians. That is, this is the view that's often referred to as Europe as the lodestar of history, that everybody else has to follow. The second birthmark, perhaps more relevant for our purposes, and the one to which I will periodically return below, is the intimate relationship, one may even say incestuous relationship, between the discipline of history and the nation state. It bears remembering here that what Peter Novick has called the professionalization project, which resulted in the shift from amateur narrators of the past to university-trained and archivally grounded professional historians in the 19th century Europe, beginning with Leopold von Ranke and continuing with his followers, occurred in an era of dynamic nation-state building. For most world historians, the singular advantage of their discipline is the expansion of scale beyond that of the national community or the nation-state to a broader sense of scale, which may include a larger region or world in quotation marks, in the sense of an internally coherent area such as the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, or even the Eurasian worlds. This expansion of scale not only enables world historians to study large-scale processes of cross-cultural encounters and comparisons, but as we shall see now, can also promise to enrich scholarship done in Armenian studies. And I have a very brief section on Armenian studies, and before I go into it, I just want to quickly say that much of what I have to say here is extremely limited, because as far as I know, we have had, unfortunately, no serious critical studies of the development of the field of Armenian studies in a conceptual way ever since the time when Armenian studies became professionalized in the 19th century. So we have to keep in mind that there are limitations imposed on us on the non-availability of any historiographic or conceptual studies of how the field was formed, therefore making it very difficult for us to proceed into a future without really knowing, with a critical perspective, the past from which we came. So Armenian studies as a scholarly field goes back to the 18th and especially the 19th centuries, when European philologists, followed by Armenian ones, first became interested in the study of classical Armenian or Grapar and the manuscripts written in this language. The field has had some notable practitioners and blossomed after the Sovietization of Armenia during the second decade of the 20th century. In its institutionalized form, however, it is a relatively young field in North America and can be traced back to the 1960s with the endowment of Armenian studies chairs, first at Harvard in 1962, followed by UCLA in 1969. The field comprises of a series of disciplines: history, linguistics, philology, comparative literature, art history, and ethnomusicology. It is made up of a handful of scholars with a dozen or so graduate students, and given the small size of this field and its limited resources, it has been extremely difficult to generate diversity of opinions and to cultivate a rigorous scholarly engagement with other disciplines in the humanities and the social sciences, although recent publications indicate a gradual but noticeable shift in that direction. This, however, should not preclude us from highlighting some of the pernicious postulates that have contributed to making the field insular and offering alternative avenues of research. So I have a brief section entitled "The Nation, Form, and History, Caught in a Bad Romance?" ? The first and most important pernicious postulate of Armenian studies is the belief that the best and often only way for scholars to study the Armenian past is to do so through the prism and category of what Etienne Balibar calls the nation form. It would not be an exaggeration to claim that Armenian historical writing, whether done by professional historians or by amateur popularizers, is oversaturated with the nation form. Given the hegemonic role of the nation form in the writing of Armenian history, it is imperative for us to make a brief detour here and discuss the conceptual and narrative underpinnings of national and nationalist historiography before we return to examine other pitfalls that have characterized Armenian studies as a field. Writing more than 15 years ago in Rescuing History from the Nation, Prasanjit Duara deftly pointed out how nationalist discourse is undergirded by a post-Enlightenment model of history. Initially shaped in Europe and pirated by non-European nationalist elite in the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, post-Enlightenment history is premised on two related postulates, both of which are necessary for imagining the existence of nations. First, the narrative sustaining such a history is plotted along a time trajectory that is essentially linear and teleological. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Although we may take linearity for granted due to its ubiquitous nature in historical representations, we should not underestimate its centrality for historical writing on the nation form. The second postulate of post-Enlightenment history is the existence of a unitary subject that gives coherence and a sense of purpose to the past. For nationalist discourse, the historical subject par excellence is the nation. The latter is the master subject of history in the sense that it is the governing consciousness that animates the past and impels forward its own self-manifestation. It is a subject that, quote, changes as it remains the same. While it undergoes alterations in time, it also retains its underlying essence or spirit. Its presence permeates the entire historical field so that even in the midst of foreign occupations and catastrophes, the nation's spirit is seen to be continuously present and a driving force in its own narrative. Part of the magic and efficacy of nationalist discourse lies in its ability to tell a morally redemptive story about the national subject's self-unfolding across time. To tell such a story, nationalist discourse relies on a mode of implotment that belongs to a literary genre that historian Hayden White identifies as being supremely preoccupied with a drama of redemption through self-identification. That is to say, the implotment mode known as the romance genre of implotment. And here, of course, my allusion to a popular Lady Gaga song in the title of this section should become evident for those of you who are pop culturally informed. The story begins with the unity of the subject and narrates its fall from grace, its period of alienation or splitting, only to conclude on a redemptive note. With minor variations, nearly all types of nationalisms, including even those that are mutually antagonistic, tell this story by classifying historical time in three general stages or periods. The initial period of this drama is coeval with the founding moment of the national subject, its first appearance on the historical stage in the process of self-formation or self-constitution. From this originary or pure state, the nation then continues to generate itself by using the time of history and the space of territory as its raw materials. This period of purity, however, proves to be short-lived, for in the course of its unfolding, the national subject inevitably encounters other subjects and clashes with foreign substances that gradually enter into its orbit. A process of corrosion sets into the body of the nation as its essence is subverted, its mark of distinction removed, its seal of authenticity adulterated and defiled from without. The inevitable consequence of this enfeebling of the nation's body is the loss of statehood, either as an immediate result of foreign occupation or through the gradual decay of the nation's spiritual values because of alien influences. Nationalist grand narratives represent this stage as constituting the long, dark ages of medievalism and decline. However, even in the midst of these sudden upheavals, often of a catastrophic nature, the nation is not entirely corrupted. As a result of external or internal subversion, the members of the national community may be asleep or slumbering, to use a popular trope of nationalist discourse, but the national idea itself or the vitalist principle is not irretrievably lost. In fact, it continues to exercise its sway over the general trajectory of the nation's self-manifestation. It is this vitalist principle that paves way for the third and most critical stage of the nation's history, that is to say, the period of revival or resurgence, hence the tropes of Renaissance and rebirth one encounters so often in the writing of national/nationalist history or histories. So far, my discussion has focused on the narrative strategies that go into the making of nationalist historiography. We can readily identify some of the conceptual features I have touched upon above in most Armenian nationalist historical writing. What is a more important task, however, is to ask whether the conceptual discussion above has any relevance at all to the scholarship produced by Armenian studies scholars in North America or in Europe. How crucial, in other words, are the distinctions between the scholarly national histories produced by the Armenian studies establishment and the polemical nationalist histories against which the scholarly national histories are often engaged? That this is not a simple question is perhaps obvious, and it is certainly not a question that I seek to resolve in the limited scope of my presentation here. However, we must at least begin by posing the question and by exploring its implications on the work that we produce as Armenian studies scholars and historians. Do scholarly national histories unwittingly end up reproducing the very thing against which they seek out to deconstruct? Or criticize. This is the big question I have, at least I'm posing it, I'm not resolving it, but I'm putting it out there. Let us look at some of the standard national histories produced over the last few decades in North America. Some of this work, such as Razmik Panosian's The Armenians from Kings and Priests to Merchants and Commissars, Richard Hovhannisyan's 2-volume edited collection of essays, The History of the Armenian People, Simon Payaslian's History of Armenia, George Bernutian's History of the Armenian People, A.E. Redgate's The Armenians, or Ron Suni's somewhat older but conceptually perhaps still unsurpassed Looking Towards Ararat, are impressive works of synthesis and have raised the bar of Armenian scholarship of scholarship in Armenian studies. As respectful and appreciative as I am of some of this diverse body of scholarship, I am also somewhat concerned about two general sources of weakness in these works that warrant special but brief attention here. First, these national histories are works of synthesis, and as such, they rely almost exclusively on secondary source literature in the field. As a practicing world historian myself, I am aware of the potential value of works of synthesis that are grounded on secondary source research. However, while the field of world or global history has a vast and rich body of secondary source material upon which to build, the same, unfortunately, cannot be said for the small and relatively new field of Armenian studies. Therefore, excessive reliance on secondary and often even tertiary sources runs the risk of reproducing the very same drawbacks that are found often at the source. The second source of weakness has to do with the way historical narratives are framed in these works. Historical accounts of the Armenian nation, or people, have necessarily relied upon a linear narrative to chart the unfolding of the Armenian national subject in history. For the most part, this unfolding is presented as internally driven by the national subject, as it smoothly unfolds from its originary moment of birth, followed by a period of splitting from its originary essential identity, usually as a result of some foreign agent or substance, for the most part identified as Turkic nomads or as overzealous Muslims eager to proselytize their vanquished subjects, drifting into its orbit. Then, in a romance mode of implantment, the national subject reconciles with its pristine self, usually described as the period of awakening or from its slumber, as in the 18th and 19th century Armenian revival and Renaissance, and finally attains its cherished telos, a nation state of its own, like other civilized nations, of course, mostly in Europe. It goes without saying that unlike nationalist history, The scholarly national history does not usually represent this process as an inevitable unfolding of the national essence. Writers of national histories may emphasize their break in terms of narrative deployment from the traditional nationalist discourse they seek to criticize by presenting the nation's history as a negotiated and conjunctural outcome highly fraught with contingencies, though of course this is rarely the case with all the works referred to above. In short, absent the political element of nationalist discourse and the illusion of inevitability, the linear teleological narrative of these national histories bears an uncanny resemblance to the very same nationalist narratives some of these works set out to deconstruct. Such resemblance includes a near exclusive focus on survival and persistence of the Armenians as a recognizable national community across time and space. While concentration on survival is understandable given the often tragic history of the Armenians, as Sunni himself pointed out a number of years ago, it has led to unfortunate intellectual practices, one of which is the assumption that there has always been and always will be an Armenian spirit or soul, characterizing all Armenians and acting as the master subject of their national history. Thus, in the introduction of his 2-volume edited collection, Hovhannisyan characterizes Armenian history as, quote, the unceasing struggle for national survival, unquote, and singles out for attention how, despite the turbulence and the long periods of foreign domination, Armenians, quote, created a rich and colorful culture and defensive mechanisms for survival. That ensured, of course, the unfolding in linear history of what we have called above the national subject. To be sure, while Hovhannisyan does not resort to using terms like soul or spirit, while referring to the Armenian nation form, he does resort to using, he does on one occasion at least aver that Armenian cultural forms such as music, architecture, theater, and art are, quote, reflectors of the spirit and soul of a people, unquote. A similar concern for survival characterizes other works, such as Burnutian's Popular History, mentioned above. In a chapter on, quote, Armenia under Turkish, Mongol, and Turkmen domination, Burnutian writes the following. At the dawn of the modern period, the East, that is to say the Islamic world, entered a gradual period of hibernation and decline. Armenia, which in the past had been at the forefront of cultural exchange, was cut off from the West by the Ottomans. Now but a small Christian enclave in a sea of Muslims and nomads, Armenia and its inhabitants fell into stagnation which lasted until the 19th century, unquote. After this low ebb in history, the national spirit of the Armenians, to use Burnutian's terminology, migrates west to the major cities of Europe and as well as to the European-ruled cities in Asia, that is to say Madras, Calcutta, and Surat probably, where, quote, the revival of Armenian culture and the next crucial chapters of Armenian history would be played out. By privileging the nation form as the master subject in the writing of Armenian nationalist history, these authors by necessity frame their narratives of the formation of the nation around what Etienne Balibar calls a linear project stretching over centuries, where the emphasis is on analyzing and describing the different stages and moments of the nation's coming to self-awareness of the self-manifestation of the national personality, unquote. Charting such a self-manifestation of the national personality, to use Balibar's words, involves at least two strategic modes of narrating the past implicit in the writing of most Armenian national histories. One is the privileging of what I shall call following Joseph Fletcher, the vertical continuity of the national subject at the expense of exploring horizontal continuities or lateral connections that are englobing in nature. The other is the displacement from the nation's history of other possible histories that, as Balibar suggests, national historians would regard as less rather than more decisive for the formation of the nation's personality. We shall return to both of these points later. the hegemonic role of the nation form in Armenian historiography has, on the whole, resulted in the downplaying of displacement of cross-cultural encounters and interactions between Armenians and others, even around them, even when, or especially when, Armenians were living as diasporic communities in foreign states, thus giving the false impression that Armenian communities, whether in the homeland or in the dispersion, maintained an unchanging national essence, a national soul or spirit, if you will, unfolding continuously across time and space. The field has tended to privilege vertical transmission of Armenian identity, often used in the singular, at the expense in the singular, passed on like a sacred torch from one generation to another across space and time. To be sure, this fixation with the torch of survival and identity is a reflection of certain underlying historical realities, and not least of which is the close encounter with cultural and physical extermination that Armenians experienced during the genocidal campaigns of 1915. The great crime of genocide, needless to say, in all of its enormity and complexity, has cast a long shadow across the writing, on Armenian identity and scholarship. As a result of the genocide trauma and state-sanctioned denial of this event, many Armenians around the world have succumbed to what I have called elsewhere, following the work of the brilliant Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges, the Funes el Memorioso effect, which I won't have to go into because I had to cut down my paper. The post-genocide fixation with maintaining identity in the singular and vertical modes has more often than not precluded interest in other kinds of histories and identities in which Armenians in the past have also engaged. The privileging and representation of the nation form's identity in the vertical mode, as opposed to the complex world historical study of cross-cultural interactions of identities, interaction of identities in the horizontal or lateral mode, becomes perhaps most obvious in historical writing on the Armenian diaspora, which to a large extent makes up a significant portion of the scholarship in Armenian history. Thus, in what is arguably the first multi-volume study of the Armenian diaspora communities in the world, published in Cairo in 1941, from 1941 to 1961, and I'm referring here to Arshak Alboyadjan's Batmutun Hay Gahtaganutyan, History of Armenian Immigration. Alboyadjan provides the following conceptual model underpinning his study of the Armenian diasporan history, and I quote here, in translation. Referring to the exiles from Armenia, he writes, "Everywhere persecuted and crushed and continuously encountering blows and disrespect, but swallowing and digesting silently and with slavish accommodation, they, the exiled multitudes from the homeland, would continue to march. By accommodating themselves to the conditions of their new locations, through creativity, cunning, and especially stubbornness, they would keep their eyes fixed on Ararat. Ararat and Echmiadzin would give the exiles spirit and breath and inspire them to persevere and endure," unquote. Having thus established this general framework of inquiry where the focus is squarely placed on the perseverance and continuous hardship, along with the responsibility of not dropping the torch of identity but tenaciously clasping it, while of course fixing one's gaze at Ararat and Echmiadzin, Alboyadjan then proceeds to examine separate Armenian diasporas on a global scale. Like subsequent work in this genre, Alboyadjan almost exclusively relies on Armenian language sources to narrate his history, which in turn, of course, reinforces his pattern recognition for vertical continuity. Regrettably, most scholarships relying on Alboyadjan has uncritically reproduced what Salo Baron, the historian of the Jewish diaspora, in a different context called the lachrymose conception of history, along with its attendant insularity or insular narrative. On the whole, the trend has been to emphasize the miseries, hardships, and persecutions of diasporic life for the Armenians. This lachrymosity has resulted in sketches of diasporic Armenian life that downplay creative interactions occurring in the interstices of the nation form, as it were, and leave Armenians undisturbed in their national essence as they follow a linear as they follow a linear vertical path of historical evolution away from the corrupting influences of other cultures and histories to the ultimate resting place of their historical motion, that is, the homeland of the nation state. It would not be unreasonable to suggest that this linear and teleological approach to Armenian history, as the often inevitable unfolding of the national essence to its historical nirvana of the nation state, would result in downplaying, if not the displacement of interactions with the other or the Odar, on the grounds that such interactions would pollute or at the very least disturb the nation form which scholars of nationalist discourse have described as the subject that changes as it remains the same. This would be particularly the case where the influences and interactions involve the world of Islamic Asia as the civilizational other, often identified by Armenian historians consciously or not, and I emphasize or not, as the foreign agent to have deflected the Armenian nation form from its linear odyssey in history. Exceptions are sometimes made for Christian Europe or Russia, however, where the influences of cross-cultural interactions are deemed to be creative and often regenerative of the Armenian national essence. I won't go into some of the treatment or popular representation of the Islamicate or the Islamic world in Armenian scholarship because of time constraints, but we can talk about it if you'd like later. While the insular historical writing stemming from the nationalist mode of imagining the Armenian past has been particularly entrenched in Armenia, both of the Soviet and especially post-Soviet periods, it has not been altogether absent from the way the field is practiced in North America, where it has been compounded by yet another problem more characteristic of American life in American universities. What I have in mind here is the culture of area studies that has proliferated across American universities, partly as a result of the Cold War. Certainly, the area studies experiment in the U.S. should not be categorically written off as a scholarly disaster as some of its critics have made it out to be. It has, after all, allowed some disciplines and the histories they seek to represent to survive in an environment dominated by Eurocentric and Euro-American scholarship, as well as scholarship linked to large and recognizable civilizations with imperial pasts to boast of. In this context, the establishment of Armenian studies chairs in major universities such as Harvard, Columbia, the University of Michigan here, and UCLA, to name a few, can justifiably be credited with rescuing Armenian scholarship and history from oblivion and safeguarding it from the catastrophic effects of the Armenian genocide. They have also set the foundations upon which a new generation of scholars can begin to reassess critically the field, although one could also argue that much of the Armenian scholarship has only recently begun to go beyond this foundational basis. However, the area studies mold into which Armenian studies was born and soon after institutionalized has reinforced the kind of isolation and insulation of the Armenian past from other civilizations and histories. In a sense, both area studies and nationalism can be seen as having conspired to sever the rich and complex connections and interactions that have gone into the making of the Armenian past. A third pernicious postulate has been the tendency to sever connections not only with other histories, but perhaps more troublingly, with other social sciences and humanities disciplines. The dominant discipline that has characterized and fueled the growth of Armenian studies in North America and elsewhere has been philology. That this textual tradition, akin in some respects to Orientalism, has been a mixed blessing for the field. On the one hand, it has not been susceptible to some of the problems associated with nationalist scholarship discussed above. The wave of philological scholars and scholarship also brought with it some of the first serious attempts not only to study the rich corpus of Armenian manuscripts dating back to the 5th or 6th centuries, but also their scholarly translations into European languages. And we have or at least one of the translators here with us today. I don't know if he's here, but he was earlier with us, Robert Thompson. The translation work has been important, it has also discouraged scholars from exploring the social, economic, and environmental foundations which sustain the literary cultures that produced these texts. The study of social and economic history, historical sociology, anthropology, and environmental history has not been on the whole part and parcel of the way Armenian studies has been practiced or taught. A similar tendency of methodological parochialism has also afflicted Armenian studies even when the discipline has been housed in departments of history and practiced by professional historians. Much of the focus of historical work in this respect, produced in this area as late as the 1990s, has been framed in the outmoded genre of political or diplomatic history, in some ways eerily reminiscent of the l'histoire événementielle, criticized and largely subverted in the wake of Fernand Braudel's monumental work and the consolidation of the annal paradigm in the middle of the 20th century. With very few exceptions, awareness of larger debates within the discipline of history has largely been absent in Armenian historical scholarship. Theoretical training in the social sciences and the humanities has been almost unheard of until recently, either in the works published by Armenian studies scholars or in the curriculum used to train students in the field. Certainly, a significant paradigm shift is in order if the discipline is to survive and to thrive in the coming decades. I do not, of course, intend to offer a blueprint for such a shift in the course of this talk, but merely to suggest a number of possible avenues where a more theoretically informed and sustained use of the world historical notions of interactions, networks of circulation and exchange, and hemispheric or global connectivity that results from them may be pursued. Since my enterprise here, contrary to appearances, is a humble attempt at building on the work of an earlier generation of Armenian studies scholars, and not at all meant to diminish the importance of their legacy, it is only fitting that I begin with some comments on the seminal work of Nina Garsoian. Looking back at the development of Armenian studies in North America in the course of the 20th century, Nina Garsoian's prolific career stands out as a critical juncture for the emergence of a more interactive and cross-cultural approach to the study of the Armenian pasts. After all, it was she who made arguably one of the most penetrating yet rather simple on the face of it observations on the general pattern of pre-modern Armenian history. Known to many of her students and colleagues as Garsoian's law, this observation appears to have never been elaborated in any systematic fashion in Garsoian's published work. The closest Garsoian came to putting her law into writing was in the opening lines of her entry on Armenian history in the Dictionary of the Middle Ages. And I read you a passage from this quite perceptive short analysis of Armenian history, the opening of it. Quote, "From antiquity, Armenia's geographical position at the meeting point of Greco-Roman and Iranian worlds created a situation that favored the country's cultural life, enriched it with two major traditions, but playing havoc with it with the continuity of its political history. As a general pattern, therefore, Armenia flourished only when the contending forces on either side were in near equilibrium, and neither was in a position to dominate it entirely." Now, what Garsoian seems to be saying here is that the very fact of being at a juncture, a point of articulation between two societies and cultures, enriched Armenian culture through cultural flows from either direction, east or west, or southwest, southeast. Except for moments of equilibrium, however, being caught between two mighty civilizations and states created an atmosphere of political discontinuity, instability, and on occasion havoc as one dominant power rushed in to fill the vacuum left by the other. The centrality of this law to Garsoian's larger scholarly project can only be fully appreciated when her contribution to Armenian studies scholarship is placed in the context of work that preceded her. Prior to Garsoian, scholars such as Hagop Manandian and especially Nicolas Adonts had been conscious of Armenia's unusual geographic location as a frontier region between the Greco-Roman and Iranian worlds. However, as Garsoyan soon came to realize, the focus of this scholarship was almost entirely on the cultural and other flows enriching Armenia's cultural traditions from only the Western or Greco-Roman side of the frontier, quote, at the expense of one half of the evidence, unquote. To counteract this scholarship and establish a balance between the influence of both Armenia's neighbors, Garsoyan recalls in her recently published memoirs that she began in the late 1960s to devote her attention to revealing the Iranian Parthian elements in early modern Armenian history. In early Armenian history, which the sources, quote, which the sources contemporary and subsequent acting as distorting mirror systematically obscured or omitted altogether. The result of this decision to expand the earlier received tradition was a rich and stimulating repertoire of historical writing that we would today call a connected history of Greco-Roman and Iranian elements in Armenia's cosmopolitan heritage. Garsoyan's trailblazing work, much of it written in the 1960s and 1970s, at a time when the scholarship of world or global history was yet to be properly formulated, offers our generation of Armenian studies scholars the opportunity of further expanding the geographic frontiers of her connected histories approach to Armenian history, and to include not just the Greco-Roman or Iranian worlds, but I would argue the entirety of Eurasia. Recent scholarship, indeed, in the rapidly growing field of pre-modern Eurasian and hemispheric world history has shed important light on how the so-called Silk Roads in the plural, emerging as early as the 1st century BCE, played an important role in unifying much of Eurasia by providing hemispheric-wide networks of exchange through which, quote, goods, ideas, diseases, and people were exchanged between major regions of Afro-Eurasia, unquote. Given the new findings of this scholarship, it will be a challenge for the new generation of Armenian studies scholars, and especially for historians, to reformulate Garsoyan's law in light of world history's challenge to the field in order to accommodate Armenia's geographic position, not only as the meeting point of the Greco-Roman and Iranian worlds, but rather more globally as a connectivity node on a larger grid of Eurasia, spanning from the Han Empire in China, the Parthian and Kushan empires in Central Asia and West Asia, the Roman Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Arsacid Ashakuni state of Armenia. Looked at through this larger hemispheric optic, many of the putatively Iranian or Greco-Roman elements, cultural and social practices informing Armenian history and society that Garsoyan writes about, namely, in this instance, the centrality of the royal hunt in rituals of power and authority in Arsacid Armenia, or Arsacid Armenian courtly culture, or the importance of the color purple, or tirani, as a symbol of royal distinction and legitimacy. To give you but two examples, in the period of antiquity and late antiquity could be seen as important adaptations of cultural practices circulating across the interactive world of Greater Eurasia, as opposed to merely creative borrowings or adaptations or emulations from either the Greco-Roman or the Iranian Parthian worlds, between which Armenia was located for much of its history. My second vignette, I just gave you one vignette of interactive history going back to Garsoyan and the classical period of the Arsacids. My second vignette, interactivity, comes in the Mongol period of Eurasian history, roughly stretching from circa 1209 to 1368 CE, during which Armenia and Armenians became much more tightly integrated into a larger Eurasian world created by the expansion of the Mongol Empire than they were during antiquity. Despite the existence of multiple primary source accounts from this period, written by Armenian scribes, and the obvious potential of studying significant changes in Armenian culture and history resulting from the cross-cultural encounters made possible by Mongol expansion, Armenian scholars have, on the whole, remained largely indifferent to such concerns. Here again, the tendency in the historiography has been towards an autonomous and insular reading of Armenian history at the expense of a more interactive conception. Needless to say, world historians have long discussed the impact of the Pax Mongolica in fostering hemispheric integration across Eurasia through networks of circulation along which not only destructive diseases and bacilli, such as the bubonic plague, as well as world conquerors were able to circulate from China to Europe in a relatively or remarkably short time, but also merchants, commodities, and cultural and mental constructs such as Chinese artistic motifs, usually on Mongol silk robes of investiture, presented as gifts to rulers who submitted to Mongol rule across Eurasia. As Thomas Alson notes in his book, The Culture and Conquest of Eurasia, of Mongol Eurasia, the Pax Mongolica acted essentially as a zone of contact and transmission and a conveyor belt through which cultural and commercial wares traveled between the major civilizations of Eurasia. And in fact, in the 1970s, writing as early as the 1970s, Dikran Kuyumjan demonstrated that Armenian miniature artists in the Cilician court did in fact introduce Chinese patterns in their gospel illuminations during the late 13th century. Commenting on some aspect on specific Chinese patterns that probably reached the Armenian court illuminators in the court of Cilician Armenia through royal gift exchanges or silk robes, Kuyumjan states, quote, little doubt can be cast on the Chinese borrowing or on their Chinese borrowing or inspiration. Finally, I won't have time, but I'll just quickly sum up my last vignette, which comes from my own period of early modern Armenian history, which involves one of perhaps the most significant or most cosmopolitan Armenian community of all time, that is to say the New Julfan mercantile community, whose trade networks basically stretched from London, Amsterdam, Cadiz in the west, all the way to Canton, China, and Manila, the Philippines, of course, crisscrossing all of Eurasia and West Asia as well. So scholars who have looked at this community, and in this case I'm referring to one very important scholar, have, for the most part, treated the Julfans as an isolated and unique case to Armenian history, without necessarily doing a comparative study that contextualizes and studies the Julfans in the context of other early modern Eurasian or European mercantile communities. And what I've done in my work is essentially to embed the Julfans not in the context of Armenian history. I explicitly removed them from the context of Armenian history, and I placed them in the context of global or world history, and I tried, to the best of my ability, to study the way in which they were connected to other commercial mercantile communities, and the way in which one could actually do a comparative study of the Julfans next to, for instance, the Multani Indians or the Sephardic Jews. And I also tried to connect them to the larger processes of global expansion during the early modern period. And one of the things I focused on was the influence of one particular type of contract on the Julfans, known as the Komenda contract of long-distance partnership, which scholars before me had identified as being borrowed by the Julfans from Mediterranean Venice in the 12th century. And of course, I wasn't the first person to write about this. Edmund Herzig before me broke new ground, fresh ground for me, by pointing out that rather than borrowing this Komenda contract, which was pivotal for their expansion, from the Christian Venetians in the Mediterranean, the Julfans were much more likely to borrow it from someone closer or nearer to their neighborhood. That is to say, from the world of Islamic Asia. And in fact, both Herzig and myself have tried to demonstrate that the evidence overwhelmingly points in the direction of interactivity and borrowing of this contract from the Islamic Sharia rather than from Venice. And I would argue the reason why Venice has been focused is because of two things. One, ignorance of world history at large, on world history as a whole. And two, the Romance mode of implantment, which I emphasized earlier on, tends to privilege vertical continuity of intra-Armenian developments. So I will conclude with this, and I will say that not everything is obviously depressing. There are some, and of course I will preface what I've said by saying that it's a very small field, so we should not have unreasonable expectations from it. We should realize the limitations of the field and so on, but still be able to make constructive criticism and be able to also welcome and be open to constructive or even destructive criticisms by people who do not agree with us. So I will conclude on a brighter note by saying that the insular and self-displacing tendencies that characterize some but not all of work of the earlier generation of Armenian studies and scholars and Armenian studies scholars and historians gives us room to be optimistic that a younger generation, younger members of the most recent crop of Armenian studies scholars are in fact working to overcome these obstacles. Indeed, in recent years, the field seems to be gradually moving in the direction of interactive history and at least aware of the need to integrate and connect Armenian scholarship to larger concerns of world history and Middle Eastern studies. In fact, Huri Berberian's work, and I should say she is my wife, so I'm biased in this respect, as well as Bedros Dermatosian's recent dissertation on the Ottoman Constitutional Revolution, demonstrate that Armenian history and historiography are on their way to being well integrated into Middle Eastern studies. Similarly, the recent work of Seta Dadoyan, Peter Kawi among us today, and others in exploring the interactive dimension of Armenian and Islamicate history also seems to be a symptom of a larger sea change in the field. Scholarship carried out on Armenian art and architecture has in recent years also seen a pronounced development along interactive lines, possibly as a result of what may be called the cross-cultural turn in historical scholarship, that many world historians and Middle Eastern scholars in particular should find to be a welcome sign of things to come. In conclusion, the field of Armenian studies and Armenian history is a young and developing field. Until very recently, it has for the most part been characterized by high levels of insularity, most likely owing to its uncritical adoption of the nation form as the central, if not exclusive, optic through which Armenian history is examined. It is hoped that the future generation of trained in the field, and particularly in Armenian history, will continue building on the foundations laid down by the scholars who preceded them, but also remain open to broadening and deepening their field by being more attentive to methodological insights offered by world historians. A more interactive approach to Armenian history, incorporating methodological insights from world history and connected histories, as well as an openness to incorporating theoretical perspectives from other disciplines, can only help in the end to open up the field of Armenian studies and Armenian historiography and enable scholars of the Armenian pasts to capture the complexities and nuances of Armenian history that the insular approaches associated with the centrality attributed to the nation form in historical writing are simply unable to do. Moreover, integrating a more world historical approach can help showcase Armenian history and attract the attention of a new generation of global historians to a rich and complex world that for too long has regrettably been studied on has regrettably remained on the margins of world history. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebouh, for this provocative talk. It sounds like a Gothic novel rather than a romance to me. So we'll move now from the kinds of metaphors that world history has provided to challenge Armenian historiography, metaphors like interconnectedness, interactions, connectivity, and cross-cultural travel and mobility to other possible ways of breaking the insularity also of Armenian history, with our next speaker, Stephen Rapp, who will be drawing on his knowledge of world history himself. He's a student of both Professor Fine, who's a Byzantinist here at the University of Michigan in the history department, as well as Ron Sunni, our very own Caucasian and Armenian historian who we are honoring here today and for the last few days as well. Stephen Rapp was pivotal, an architect in establishing the World History and Cultural program at Georgia State University, where he is an associate professor right now. He's worked mainly on Georgian medieval historiography, and today he's going to be talking to us about shedding the civilizational straitjacket, critical metageographies, synergetic historiographies, and expanded Armenian vistas in the pre-national age. Let's welcome Stephen Rapp.
The mouse isn't working. This is why you shouldn't use technology. See, Kevork, you were going to help me with technology problems, right?
See here.
Did that work? It was working before. Well, it's not entirely essential, so I had pretty pictures. And you might want the pictures.
But they make a good point. It's present too.
Yeah. So maybe we turn it on and off. Yeah, turn it on and off. That would help. Let's see.
We do Control-Alt-Delete, I guess. Yeah, let's see. Where's the Control-Alt-Delete? Of course, we can't, because we need the mouse to click on. Where's the?
Let's see. On and off. That's electrolytes. How about escape? Sometimes that helps.
Is it up here? Nope.
No. Why don't you start off and then I'll see if we can get a...
Okay. Sorry about that. First, I'd certainly like to thank the Armenian Studies program for the invitation and for putting up with me for a few years in the 1990s. And to single out Ron and Kevork and Gerard, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Despite its impressive sophistication, the historical discipline at the start of the 21st century remains encumbered by basic units of analyses which are as deceptive and restrictive as they are convenient and ingrained. The circumstance is most obvious on the large scale, where a Western privileging paradigm of nested continents, civilizations, and nation-states still prevails. This jigsaw vision of the world has been loudly criticized across academic fields, and yet the notion persists of a world that was and remains neatly divided into continents, which contain culturally essentialized civilizations, and which in turn consist of discrete ethno-linguistic groups, and especially nation-states. This model, this assumption, this ideologically colored straitjacket has proven difficult to escape. Disproving and replacing the Eurocentric civilizational paradigm has been complicated by the fact that peoples whose cultures, histories, and lands were devalued and disparaged by it have almost universally adopted it, though sometimes tweaking and even turning it on its head for their own benefit. Consider, for example, the so-called Indian subcontinent. If Europe is a continent, then why not South Asia? And yet the subcontinent is sometimes invoked with great pride in scholarship produced in South Asia. For while it may be hierarchically subordinate to Europe, it nevertheless distinguishes the region within an expansive Asia. As well-intentioned as such adjustments might be, changing the priority of the actors does not alter the fact that the civilizational scheme remains prone to ethnocentric and ideological agendas. It fundamentally operates outside the realm of history. It remains fundamentally ahistorical. The notion that the world is naturally divided into discrete civilizations gives comforting order to an otherwise chaotic Earth. Historians who work on large scales, and world historians in particular, are seekers of unity realized, unrealized, and imagined. Notwithstanding their remarkable historiographical endurance, civilizations, continents, and nation-states, along with yet other pervasive units of meta-geographical analyses, including the binary opposition of East and West, the notion of the first, second, and third worlds, all of these obscure more than they reveal. Significantly, all of these categories, like the well-known phenomenon of Orientalism, have their roots in the early modern global imperial and colonial projects of Western Europe. Now, this is not to suggest, however, that we must immediately and summarily discard such ideas, but it is incumbent upon specialists to show an awareness of them, to assess their shortcomings and limitations, to salvage and adjust when possible, and to adopt non-ethnocentric concepts and vocabularies when necessary. Units of large-scale analyses must be historically conceived. They must reflect cross-cultural, multicultural, and multi-perspective historical experiences. They must not impose unwarranted unity or disunity, and they must not unfairly privilege one community at the expense of others. The civilizational model once served an important historical and especially historiographical purpose, particularly in connection with the unprecedented destruction wrought by the First World War. World and global history first emerged as a legitimate academic endeavor in the first half of the 20th century. In the initial stage, dominated by a group my friend Jerry Bentley has aptly characterized as the philosophers of world history, European intellectuals advanced civilizations and complex cultures as the fundamental building blocks of large-scale history across all chronological and geographical spaces. The best-known representatives of this movement are the German philosopher Oswald Spengler, author of The Decline of the West, and the British classicist Arnold Toynbee, who penned the 12-volume A Study of History, the first installments of which appeared in 1933. Many of you may know Toynbee through his publications about Armenians, including The Armenian Atrocities, The Murder of a Nation, and The Western Question in Greece and Turkey, a study in the contact of civilizations, as well as the edited collection entitled The Treatment of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, 1915 to 1916. In this period, other Europeans of widely varying backgrounds also contributed to the civilizational paradigm, including the Russian sociologist Petrim Alexandrovich Sorokin and the well-known British novelist H.G. Wells, whose best-selling An Outline of History was often used as a high school textbook. As I recall, it was the best-selling publication in history in the first half of the 20th century in the English-speaking world. The vision of civilizations elaborated in this initial period of world historiography remains highly influential to this day, nearly 100 years later. The basic structure was established principally in the writings of Spengler and Toynbee. To their credit, their understanding of the world was not limited to a single Western civilization. Rather, their understanding of the world, to their credit, their understanding of the world was not limited to a single Western civilization. Rather, they identified many viable and independent civilizations spread over the face of the earth. Spengler, Toynbee, and their colleagues saw nation-states and ethnic groups as woefully inadequate for the study of history. The crises of the First World War, including the use of weapons of mass destruction, the proliferation of rabid nationalism, the dangers of fascism, and in the case of Wells, unfettered environmental degradation, all of these necessitated a global perspective because now all humanity was confronted by the same threats. If nothing was done to right the ship, the human species as a whole faced Armageddon. The drawbacks to this model have been roundly criticized by a somewhat amorphous scholarly project Ross Dunn and others have called the New World History, which we've just heard a lot about, and I apologize for a bit of repetition. First, in their historiographical heyday, civilizations were typically projected through the dual ahistorical lenses of cultural essentialism and determinism. Civilizations were deemed to consist of a single essentialized culture whose preordained life cycle proceeded from birth, continued through maturity, and ended in inescapable death. Second, interactions between and among civilizations were envisaged as insignificant at best and destructive at worst. When such interactions existed, they have been unsustainable and they have resulted in a negative outcome. Toynbee famously talked about jazz. He hated jazz and said, this is what happens when you have cross-cultural encounters. There is another fundamental problem. Interactions were usually portrayed as radiating one way from some uniquely inventive imperial center. So the model was straight out absolute diffusion. But now, of course, as we've heard, there's a much more sophisticated understanding of dynamic interaction, exchange, and encounter. Finally, in most civilizational models, so-called Western civilization is awarded a privileged position, in much the same way that tiny Europe continues to be counted as one of the world's continents when South Asia is not. The civilizational model, which dominated the 20th century, thus broadened the historiographical horizons of Western Europe, North America, and their allies. but it also exaggerated the place and importance of Western civilization at the expense of others. The model is inherently Eurocentric, and the model is inherently about European identity in a global or globalizing hegemonic context. Now, all of this set the stage for the publication in 1963 of William McNeill's Rise of the West, A History of the Human Community. McNeill accepted the basic premise of civilizations as laid out by Spengler and Toynbee, with an important caveat. Instead of cross-cultural interactions being incidental, temporary, and negative, McNeill moved them to the center of analysis and historical experience and made them the driving force of not just world history, but history. Moreover, he acknowledged both their negative and positive aspects. Following the publication of such a groundbreaking monograph, many scholars might have been satisfied to rest on their laurels, to dig in their feet, and spend the rest of their careers defending it. McNeill, however, did no such thing. He did not hesitate to revise and improve his model, as we see, for example, in his Plagues and Peoples, an influential trans-regional investigation of pandemics first published in 1977. Perhaps the most important shift in McNeill's vision is its replacement of straightforward cultural diffusion with dynamic and polycentric webs of human interaction. This latter model is described in the 2003 book, The Human Web, A Bird's Eye View of World History, which was co-authored with his son, J.R. McNeill. Of course, there have been other pioneers and champions of cross-cultural approaches, and here I would single out just one of them, Marshall Hodgson, whose 3-volume Venture of Islam, Conscience and History in a World Civilization, remains an underrated conceptual masterpiece of both Islamic and world history, despite its quirks. Spurred in large measure by a burgeoning interest in regional, trans-regional, and global history, multidisciplinary investigations of the full range of cross-cultural encounters and exchanges, including economic and ecological ones, emerged by the 1980s as a leading approach within the new world history. They've made a profound imprint upon the historical discipline as a whole, and vice versa. Publications devoted to the Caucasian and the Black Sea world by Neil Atchison, Charles King, and Thomas DeWall all owe a great deal to this development. At the same time, historians and their colleagues in affiliated fields took a growing interest in identity, and this helped to inspire a renewed scrutiny of entrenched metageographical concepts. In many respects, large-scale history was freshly validated, but the received terms and models were found to be plagued by a persistent ethno and particularly Eurocentrism. Recent attempts have been made to salvage the civilizational scheme once again by redefining it, or in the case of the essays in Stephen Sanderson's Civilizations and World Systems, Studying World Historical Change, to fuse civilizations with other metageographical and transnational projects. The essays in the Sanderson volume, for instance, attempt to mediate a revised notion of civilizations with the world systems theory, first articulated by Emanuel Wallerstein, and thereafter modified by numerous scholars, including André Gunder Frank and Janet Abu-Lughod. But in many respects, the ideological baggage is simply too heavy, and thus, in my view, it is high time to abandon civilizations and their continental counterparts. The popularity of the ideologically driven clash of civilizations, a throwback to the rabid Eurocentrism of the 19th century, demonstrates the latent dangers lurking in the concept. So civilizations are not innocuous. They are deeply coated with global power and hegemony. They are largely artificial concepts which show minimal and selective regard for human and physical landscapes. They are, as I have said, largely ahistorical. Now, the New World history is by no means a perfect solution. One of its most serious shortcomings is the tendency to lose sight of relatively small communities, both in terms of numerical population as well as spatial distribution. Here it should be remembered that professional world history, as it has taken shape since the 1970s and 1980s, is not the sum total of national and ethnic histories. Instead, its concerns are fundamentally cross-cultural, trans-regional, and global, connective, and comparative. What's more, cultures and peoples may well fall within multiple categories of large-scale experience and analysis. As should be obvious, Armenians enjoy a historiographical advantage here, for their experiences across time coincide with all of these connective categories. Now, two aspects of Armenian history have particularly attracted world historians. First, the mass deportations and the genocide of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire at the start of the 20th century. World historians have most frequently examined this topic as part of comparative investigations with other genocides. And as I've already noted, Toynbee, one of the pioneers of the world historical profession, took an active interest in this subject. The second aspect is the establishment of a far-flung Armenian diaspora long before the genocide. In the interest of time, I'll limit these brief remarks to the economic dimension of the diaspora. Since my own research focuses on late antiquity and the medieval period, here I would mention Jakob Manyandian's 1930 book, translated into English by Nina Garsoyan under the title Trade and Cities of Armenia in Relation to Ancient World Trade. More recently, specialists have examined specific aspects of the Armenian trading diaspora, including the extraordinary impact upon trans-Eurasian commerce played by New Jolfa. Scholars of Armenian ancestry have been rightly attracted to this topic, but world historians of other ethnocultural backgrounds have also investigated it. An interesting and prominent example of this is the work of the late Philip Curtin, who devotes an entire chapter of his 1984 Cross-Cultural Trade in World History to the Armenian diaspora's role in facilitating trade between East Asia and Western Europe in the 17th century. As you may know, Curtin was a central figure in the world history movement. He was a leading historian of Africa, although he always took care to situate his historical subjects within regional, super-regional, and global frameworks. In addition, Curtin demonstrated the viability and necessity of establishing graduate research and teaching programs in world history. Effective and cutting-edge historical analyses routinely deploy approaches and methodologies which exemplify the new world history, though many do not explicitly acknowledge it. There are many names I might mention in this connection, but allow me to say a few words about someone you've already heard about, Nina Garsoyan. To my mind, over the past half-century, Garsoyan has been the preeminent historian of late antique and early medieval Armenians. Garsoyan's engaging inter- and cross-disciplinary research on the Iranian substratum of early Armenian historiographical texts and on the larger Armeno-Iranian nexus has shed new light on the cosmopolitan and syncretic Near East. Her meticulous historical work builds upon the solid foundation laid not only by Nicholas Adonts, but especially Cyril Tumanov. And it reminds us that there was not just one, but there were several Armenias in late antiquity. Garsoyan has shown a special interest in the early Christian age and has examined, among other things, how Armenians reconciled their Iranic culture with the new Christian religion. Relations between the various Armenias in the Eastern Mediterranean had been close for centuries, but King Tirdut's adoption of Christianity in the early 4th century raised the possibility of an even closer relationship with the Roman Empire. Garsoyan reminds us of the crucial role Armenians played in the life of the later Roman and Byzantine empires. And indeed, Armenians constituted the largest minority population within these enterprises. At the same time, Armenian identity remained a complex affair. From the 6th and 7th centuries, the bulk of Armenians were aligned theologically against the Diophysite Christology adopted at the Fourth Ecumenical Council of Chalcedon, but there were substantial communities of Chalcedonian Armenians in eastern Anatolia and elsewhere. In the borderlands of Caucasian Anatolia, Armenian, Georgian, and Greek families often mixed. And we see this in a 1974 publication by Alexander Kazhdan, who talks specifically about the mixing of these families and how many of them were highly mobile within Byzantine society, rising even to the very ranks of the imperial family. The famous 11th century Byzantine general Gregory Pakourianos is another representative of one of these mixed Armeno-Georgian and perhaps Greek families. As it so happens, one of the principal limitations of Armenian studies also affects Byzantine studies. There is a tendency to reduce the Caucasus region to the Armenian experience. I should emphasize that a similar reduction also plagues the ethno-national histories of other Caucasian peoples. The Armenians are hardly unique in this regard, so especially in terms of Georgian historiography, we see the exact same kind of phenomenon. Now, at various stages of her illustrious career, Garsoyan herself has made a special effort to integrate Armenian, Georgian, and Caucasian Albanian history. We see this, for instance, in her essay, Iran and Caucasia, which kicks off the collection Transcaucasia Nationalism and Social Change, edited by Ronald Sunni. More recently, Garsoian teamed with her colleague Bernadette Martin-Isard to produce the inspiring Unité et Diversité de la Caucasie médiévale, an English version of which will soon be appearing in a volume on medieval Georgia I'm editing for Ashgate. Garsoian and Martin-Isard in this essay with a summary of the approaches needed to elaborate an integrated history of Caucasia. And integrated is the key word here. We must take up, they write, and I quote, the corpus of all of medieval Caucasia's sources without cutting them up, without distorting them, without rejecting any, and without believing them entirely, while taking into account their genre and their date, and a reasoned and a reasonable chronology of Caucasia that does not seek to hide its lacunae. We need a non-exclusive prosopography of those who were associated with Caucasia, either being born or simply having lived there, and we need an independent historical topography of the borders and languages. When coupled with ideological aims, national and nationalist reductions of Caucasia tend to go hand in hand with the treatment of history as ethnic property. The New World History points us towards a remedy, but here a paradox arises. World history has inspired important critiques of the nation-state and has advocated for the examination of cross-cultural, trans-regional, and global phenomena and the application of like-minded analyses. But today, world historians, at least those specializing in the pre-modern periods, for which such methodologies are on the whole rather less sophisticated, still overwhelmingly interpret and read sources from an ethno-national perspective. Now, this is understandable on several counts. First, the ingrained ethno-national focus of the historical discipline has proven difficult to escape. Second, researchers are necessarily limited by their linguistic capabilities. And third, our sources are often written from an ethno-national perspective, or at least they seem to be. Here we must remember that, say, the renowned history of the Armenians by Moses Khorenatsi is not actually a treatment of all Armenians, the integrated Armenian nation. Instead, it is a carefully crafted narrative favoring and exaggerating the experiences of elites and especially of a particular Nakharar house, the Bagratuni. Even if our sources have been written from an ethno-national vantage, our readings and analyses of them should do much more. By the same token, the bigger picture, a bird's eye view, is not simply the lumping together of ethno-national sources and historiographies. It requires a new kind of connective and comparative analysis. So here, nested continents, civilizations, nation-states, all of these we can see would absolutely obscure more than they reveal. So how do we approach Armenia and Armenians from, and not simply within, a cohesive region defined by enduring cross-cultural encounters and exchanges which overlapped with trans-regional crucibles of sustained interaction? I should probably just end my paper here, but bear with me a little longer. In order to give a sense of how we might go about this task, I shall offer some observations pertaining to the making of Christian Caucasia. Now, this is an enormous and contentious topic, so I've simply isolated a few issues which illustrate the points I wish to make. The widespread image of Caucasia's initial Christianization revolves around the 4th century conversion of the monarchies of Armenia Major, Kartli in eastern Georgia, and Caucasian Albania in what is now western Azerbaijan. This image is first and foremost the result of sources which have come down to us in a very particular way. To the 5th century belongs the surviving Armenian recension of Agathangelos, which forms the basis of a cycle of texts devoted to the activities of Gregory the Illuminator. The Gregory cycle has a Georgian parallel in the Nino cycle, which consists primarily of 2 texts, the conversion of Kartli, written in the 7th century, and the life of Nino, written in the 9th or 10th century. Although the Christian Albanians, like their Armenian and Kartvelian neighbors, possessed their own script, we have no evidence that they wrote historiographical literature in their own language. However, no later than the second half of the 10th century, a historian, or more precisely a group of historians, we know as Moses Das Khorenatsi, also called Karankaduatsi, wrote in Armenian a history of the Albanians, in which he speaks about the Christianization of the Albanian crown. Das Khorenatsi has become a lightning rod for nationalist reinterpretations. But in my view, Das Khorenatsi was an Albanian cleric who, like his Albanian contemporaries, used Armenian as his primary language. Now, all of these conversion texts have been read in two ways which have profoundly hindered their understanding. First, modern notions of identity are frequently thrust into these narratives, but this creates a false sense of unity in all three cases. It should be remembered that nothing approaching a unified Armenia or Georgia, as we know them today, existed in late antiquity. This is even more dramatic in the case of Azerbaijan, whose modern Turkic population has laid claim to the Albanians as one of their principal ancestors. Although, very interestingly, this view has taken a new turn in recent years and has been redirected to a newly created fictitious kingdom called Atropatene. Moreover, like other texts from the period, these are not so concerned with the whole of the population, but are rather narrowly focused on political and emergent religious elites. Virtually nothing is said about the rest of the population. Second, the received conversion counts are too often read uncritically and are held up as literal, more or less truthful descriptions of events as they actually transpired in the first half of the 4th century. However, it should be said that the received conversion accounts in Armenian and Georgian seem to be based on a good measure of historical truth. Yet we must acknowledge that all were consigned to writing well after the events they describe, and as a consequence, they may have been subjected to accidental changes and intentional manipulation. The content of these texts was by no means frozen at the time of their initial compositions. In no case do we possess the autographed manuscript. What have come down to us are later manuscripts, centuries removed from their original authors. These later redactions often show signs of deliberate revision and rewriting. This is particularly evident in the Gregory cycle, which has been freshly investigated in Robert Thompson's 2010 The Lives of St. Gregory, the Armenian, Greek, Arabic, and Syriac versions of the history attributed to Agathangelos. Significantly, the original Armenian version of Agathangelos is lost. The surviving recension, designated AA by scholars, derives from the 5th century, at least 100 years after the events it describes. What is more, the recensions and partial recensions of Agathangelos preserved in Armenian, Greek, Arabic, Syriac, and Georgian show significant variance. Today we have no time to explore the precise reasons for these divergences, but suffice it to say that later scribes could revise and even rewrite parts of the Gregory cycle in order to reflect later values, aspirations, and realities. This is especially true for the period following the schism with the Byzantine and Georgian churches, made permanent after the Third Council of Dvin in the early 7th century. The Third Council of Dvin, and all it represents, also had a massive impact on Georgian conversion narratives. It was, in fact, one of the primary sparks which led to the writing of the earliest surviving Georgian language accounts of conversion, and the events leading to the conversion of the Eastern Georgian king Mirian. Dvin III marks a fundamental change in the history of Christian Caucasia, for the prevailing inclusiveness, plurality, and heterogeneity of the initial centuries were now permanently supplanted with rigid orthodoxies and hierarchies. The Armeno-Georgian schism is usually attributed principally to theological differences, and these were important, but the Eastern Georgian hierarchy's push for full autonomy and autocephaly was equally important. In this environment, we can see why the Eastern Georgians would commit to writing in a particular way a story of the independent conversion of their monarchy. In order to emphasize this point, Eastern Georgian writers exaggerated a direct link to Constantine the Great and introduced another to the Patriarchate of Jerusalem in the 4th century. But there's a small hitch. The first Patriarch of Jerusalem, Juvenal, who is mentioned in the life of Nino, lived a full century later. In addition, some regional traditions proved too strong to ignore. Thus, Nino, the woman credited with the conversion of Eastern Georgia, was cast as one of the companions of the famous Hypsime and Gaiane, the holy women who play a central role in the Gregory cycle. Now, it's certainly not impossible that Nino was actually in the company of these Roman holy women, but given her complete absence in all surviving recensions of the Gregory cycle, it's more probable that the Armenian tradition was appropriated by the cleric who authored the conversion of Eastern Georgia in the 7th century. Using its own traditions against the non-Chalcedonian Armenian church proved to be an effective strategy, and it's one that was subsequently expanded by the Georgian Catholicos and polemicist Arsen Sapareli in the 11th century. The received story of Albania's conversion is especially saturated with later political considerations. Unlike the dedicated accounts about Gregory and Nino in Armenian and Georgian respectively, Das Huransi embeds his account of Albania's conversion within a larger vision. While Albania enjoyed a close cultural and social relationship with its neighbors, and especially Armenia, Albania was, he contends, legitimately and viably independent in its political and religious affairs. Here we must remember that the historian, or more likely historians we call Das Huransi, was writing as late as the 10th century, and in any case hundreds of years after the initial Christianization of the Albanian kingdom back in the 4th century. It's fascinating that Das Huransi associates Gregory the Illuminator with the conversion of the Albanian king Urnair. Indeed, Das Huransi acknowledges a prominent Armenian role in the permanent Christianization of Albania beginning in the 4th century. But Das Huransi treads very carefully here, emphasizing that, quote, the Albanians asked for the young Gregorius to be Catholicos of our king Urnair, and asked St. Gregory to consecrate him bishop of his country, not by necessity, not because the Armenians are senior to the Albanians. They decided to submit voluntarily, summon the worthy heir of St. Gregory, and were well pleased. So as to make Albania's religious autonomy crystal clear, Das Huransi fabulously traces the origins of Albanian Christianity to the earliest possible moment, the 1st century. Following the martyrdom of the apostle Thaddeus by the Armenian king Sanatruk, Erishe, Elisius, was assigned the east by St. James. Traveling first to Choghe in what is now Dagestan, Erishe then focused his proselytizing efforts in the central Albanian province of Uti. At the village of Gish, modern Kish, just above the Azerbaijani city of Shekhi, quote, the Holy Patriarch founded a church there and offered up bloodless sacrifices. This place was the original source of all the churches and cities and the conversion of all of us Easterners. Remember, this is the 1st century. In this way, Das Huransi traces the roots of Albanian ecclesiastical autonomy to the apostolic period, thus preempting, by the widest possible temporal span, the missionary activities of Gregory and his grandson Gregorius. Thus, Gregory and Gregorius merely finish what had started in apostolic times, independently of the Armenians. Now, as you can imagine, these sorts of claims have been taken up, repackaged, and amplified by modern patriots. To continue with the Albanian example, in the mid-1960s, the Azerbaijani nationalist historian Zia Bunyatov asserted that the late antique and medieval Albanians had created a rich original literature in their own language, but it had been deliberately and systematically destroyed, not just by the Arabs, but especially by the Armenians in the medieval period. Now, we might add the Turkic Seljuks here, but this would undermine Bunyatov's line of argument. Further, on the basis of nationalist passion, Bunyatov claims not only that Das Huransi had originally composed his history of the Albanians in the Albanian language, but that medieval Armenians translated and viciously adapted such Albanian texts, twisting them for their own purposes. In recent years, Bunyatov's arguments have been extended by Farida Mamidova, whose nationalist vision is presented in her Kavkazskaya Albania i Albanci, published in 2005 in Baku. According to Mamidova, Albania existed continuously and as a fully autonomous state for a millennium, from the 3rd century BC until the 8th century AD, and she points out longer than either Armenia or Georgia. She paints Albania as always peaceful, an absolutely non-expansive state which was constantly victimized by its neighbors, and especially Armenia Major. This, of course, is meant to mirror the Azerbaijanis' interpretation of what was going on in Karabakh. In order to emphasize the Albanian connections of the author of the history of the Albanians, Mamidova casts aside the Armenian-sounding names Das Huransi and Karankatuatsi, and instead calls him by the fabricated and Turkic-sounding Moses Kalankatu. Situating this so-called Kalankatu in the 8th century, she summarily dismisses connections in the text with Armenians, particularly with Gregory the Illuminator and Gregorius, and also Mashtots, claiming that they were textual manipulations introduced in the Middle Ages by hostile Armenian scribes wishing to steal and destroy Albania's, and hence Azerbaijan's, heritage. Like other Azerbaijani nationalists, she accepts quite literally that Erishe established a church building at Gish in the 1st century AD, and is certain this was the first church structure to have been erected anywhere in the world. I had some interesting pictures to show you of Gish. One of the things about this church, and it's by architecture, it's a 12th or 13th century church. Before his death, it attracted the attention of none other than Thor Heyerdahl, who concocted a theory based on a petroglyph at Gobustan, south of Baku, that the Vikings had originally come from Azerbaijan. And so the Norwegians began to pump a lot of money into Azerbaijan, and they are the ones who actually renovated the building at Gish. And there's a nice plaque, but you won't get to see it now. Even these few examples lead to one of the most important unresolved questions today facing historians of late antique Caucasia. How do historians distinguish between the genuine situation on the ground, which was hardly egalitarian, and later efforts to remold tradition so as to instill complete autonomy and, just as importantly, to privilege and to endow one party with an inherent superiority over the others? By way of a conclusion, I wish to draw the principal contours of a vision of Caucasia's Christianization, proceeding first and foremost from a cross-cultural and integrated regional vantage. This will ultimately lead, I hope, to an alternative view to existing histories that have been fitted to civilizational and to ethno-national conceptions. In this approach, I've been influenced especially by the pan-Caucasian vision of Cyril Tamanov, and certainly the meticulous scholarship of Nina Garsoyan, Robert Thompson, Robert Hewson, Nicholas Adonts, Ivana Javakashvili, Ilya Abuladze, Cornelia Kikalidze, just to name a few. While it is an absolutely legitimate scholarly exercise to examine historical phenomena from the perspective of discrete ethno-linguistic communities, such investigations reach their full potential only when they are situated within larger contexts. While we might focus upon the Christianization of the Armenians, for example, we must always take care to place it within the framework of the Christianization of Caucasia and the entire Near East. The latter has usually been done, the former not so much. Now, this was not an isolated event, the conversion of Armenia, even if our individual sources say that it was. Therefore, alongside historical examinations which proceed from ethno-linguistic vantages, it is necessary to undertake research from an inherently cross-cultural and regional perspective. First of all, we must treat Armenian and Georgian and what remains of Albanian sources not only as belonging to distinct literary traditions, but also as embodying a single, albeit diverse, Christian Caucasian tradition. These are all Caucasian sources. I use this label here not simply in a geographical sense, but particularly in a connective, in a cross-cultural sense. When we consider Armenian, Georgian, and Albanian sources as a single body of Caucasian literature, many alleged details of conversion may be identified as later accretions, but at the same time, broad and enduring patterns of development and interaction come into sharper focus. While individual Christian missionaries may have been active primarily within specific kingdoms, and hence within dominant ethno-linguistic communities of these polities, the conversion of the political elites of Armenia Major, Eastern Georgia, and Albania were the result of several cross-cultural waves of Christianization which washed upon southern Caucasia beginning in the late 3rd century. It is not surprising that Tirdot's conversion should have transpired first, for the various Armenian territories constituted Caucasia's first point of contact with Syria and Cappadocia, from where the initial waves of Christianization chiefly proceeded. Outsiders played a crucial role in the conversion of the three monarchies of southern Caucasia. Gregory was a Parthian, the Herpsimian nuns seem to have migrated from somewhere within the Roman Empire, and Nina was also reportedly from Roman domains. A later tradition makes her a Cappadocian. We must remember that Christian hierarchies were in flux everywhere in the 4th century, and Caucasia was no exception. Once kings and other elites had been converted, Christians began to work out hierarchies within the Caucasian theater. As elsewhere, these were fitted to existing social structures. But whereas dioceses and their capital cities provided a ready-made and effective model within the Roman Empire, throughout early Christian Caucasia, bishops were attached to leading aristocratic houses and to the royal family. On the largest level, these hierarchies were contained within the existing kingdoms. However, there was some overlap and fluidity, especially in contested areas. Thus, the episcopal sees of the bicultural Armeno-Georgian marchlands, known to the Armenians as Gugark and to the Eastern Georgians as Somkhiti, could, it would seem, pass back and forth between the Eastern Georgian and Armenian churches. But in the 4th and 5th centuries, Gugark was under the political control of the largely autonomous Badakhsh, and there is every reason to believe that the bishops of Gugark also enjoyed a significant amount of ecclesiastical autonomy. And we have to remember the Armenian monarchy was dissolved in 428, so this area became nominally under Georgian royal control from that time. It should be emphasized that all three received traditions of conversion focus squarely on the Christianization of the respective royal houses. This raises several crucial questions. For example, precisely how were the all-important aristocratic families converted? Some of the most prominent of these noble houses, it should be remembered, were acculturated branches of prominent Parthian families. What matters most in the received traditions is the conversion of the dynastic king. This is particularly fascinating in the Armenian case, since historiography, at least as it has come down to us, was the preserve of the most powerful Naharar houses. Moses Khoronatsi found a particularly creative solution to the royal focus. He endowed the Bagratuni clan, his sponsor, with ancient pre-Christian connections to Judaism. Thus, he was able to bypass two thorny problems: the later rise to the throne of the Bagratunis and Agathangelos' spotlight on the Arshakuni kings. Finally, I'd like to say a few words about the invention of the three Caucasian scripts. A cross-cultural reading of the sources leads to one inescapable conclusion. The received Armenian, the first Georgian, and the only known Albanian script were all created around the year 400 by Christians with the goal of consolidating and expanding the faith. Unmistakable affinities among the three scripts suggest a substantial degree of contact and shared development, and I'm confident that all three resulted from an interconnected pan-Caucasian effort. In his recent monograph, Sergei Muravyov presents evidence for the Caucasian scripts having been fashioned by a single person. In any event, our understanding of this development is at once heightened and hindered by the Armenian, Georgian, and Albanian sources, all of which, I must emphasize, have come down to us exclusively in versions and manuscripts postdating the all-important Third Council of Dvin. Therefore, while at least some of the received traditions, especially those involving Mashtots, are built upon a framework which may be traced all the way back to the turn of the 4th, 5th century, we must be extremely suspicious of the details, especially when strict hierarchical power is being asserted. In the Georgian case, the story of the creation of the Georgian script by the first Georgian king, Parnavaz, all the way back in the 3rd century BC, is pure fantasy. This tradition may have been articulated in the post-Dvin III period during the formation of the Georgian National Church as an answer to Koryun's Vita of Mashtots, which itself may well have been manipulated a bit after Dvin III. However, I think in the case of Georgia there's a better explanation. In a forthcoming book, I will argue that a Georgian epic tradition modeled upon the Sasanian history, the Khwate-nama, which is now lost, in essence an official Sasanian history which also was very epic in character, took shape in the 6th and 7th centuries. The Georgians had their own version of this kind of history. And in fact, according to the Iranian conception of history and historiography, the formation of principal aspects of society were traditionally traced back to the foundational kings. So the fabulous story of Parnavaz's invention of the Georgian script was initially an expression of the Eastern Georgians' close historiographical tie to the Iranian world. However, after Dvin III, the tale acquired a new meaning altogether and was deployed as a counterweight to Armenian claims of ecclesiastical priority within Caucasia, as had been advanced by Koryun, or at least the altered Koryun of the post-Dvin III era. Ultimately, we are faced with three fundamental tasks. First, we must identify the oldest layers of the received conversion stories. Second, we must ascertain the function and purpose of all layers, including those which are chronologically far removed from the events purportedly described. And third, we must make a distinction, on the one hand, of actual relationships in the story of conversion, relationships which were rarely egalitarian and equal, and on the other hand, of later impositions of political and ecclesiastical hegemonies, both real and desired. We must take care not to equate intimate connections and regional cohesiveness for friendly cooperation. cross-cultural partnerships were tempered with considerable tension and distrust. But whereas our sources emphasize antagonism and suspicion, an image which has been amplified by literal and nationalist readings, we must attempt to recover the cooperation which has been neglected and obscured in our received sources. And so, finally, what is to be gained? Should we situate Armenian history within its appropriate Caucasian, Near Eastern, and Eurasian contexts? And if we avoid metageographical models which too often assert privilege, a richer and more realistic vision of the Armenian experience emerges. While scholarship devoted to Armenia has made significant strides in this regard beyond the Caucasian arena, the regional threads which are so central to Armenian history deserve far closer scholarly attention. Finally, through the interdisciplinary project of the New World History, though the interdisciplinary project of the New World History is no silver bullet for the metageographical conundrum, its sophisticated interdisciplinary, cross-cultural, and trans-regional methodologies are very well suited to Armenian history and Armenian studies in general. If nothing else, by engaging the largest contexts of all, Eurasia, Afro-Eurasia, and the entire globe, we have a golden opportunity to push Armenian and Caucasian history deeper into the consciousness of the historical phenomenon. Thank you.
I won't give a comment. Yeah. So for the interest of time, I think thank you, Stephen, really for this thought-provoking paper. For the interest of time, I think I'm going to open up the floor to questions, because these are both really rich, critical interventions into Armenian historiography. I just wanted to say thank you really for bringing in these new paradigms that allow us to rethink and reconsider Armenian historiography. I just saw a tension, or maybe another possible figure of Armenianness that can be introduced instead of go-betweens and connectivities. I think maybe, in fact, looking at the figure of the Armenian as bilingual, trilingual, part of this heteroglossic culture that seems to characterize both late antique and the medieval and early modern period may be a more productive way of, another productive way of placing Armenianness and our experience. So I will invite both speakers to come to the podium, and you'll field your own questions. Come on. Together, sure.
Don't fight.
Any questions?
If you have a question, please wait for the microphone. It's more for the purposes of recording than amplification, so don't worry if it's not loud.
Okay. Well, I know that this is absolutely unfair. There is no basis for it whatsoever. But nevertheless, I am very curious. We're taking this as basically a dialogue. It's debate. Nothing is pre-prepared. Nothing is in final. Everything is open to diversity and change. So I thought I would take this opportunity to ask Sebouh. Of course, I very much appreciate your presentation. I think that everything that you said is very valid. I think it's very significant. There's a great deal to learn from it. And I'm sure that much of future Armenian historiography will follow in this line. But obviously, what you did was to present many of the opportunities and a certain amount of structures that, of course, pre-exist that could be applied. So as I say, this question is totally unfair. I realize it, but nevertheless, I'm giving it because I know that you're in exactly that situation now. So I'm very curious. This whole question about history horizontally as opposed to history vertically. Could you give us a sense then of how this actually would be done in practice? What shape would a historical, a horizontal Armenian history take?
Well, that's not an unfair question. Actually, it's I think I can answer it. Obviously, not definitively, but I'll take a stab. Basically, what I was trying to say was there are basically two axes in any kind of history, in Armenian history particularly. The vertical axis is the axis that emphasizes continuity of traditions, practices, and so on, and it's an intra-national axis. So with that axis, what I was trying to say is that it discourages, at the very least, any kind of lateral connections with other cultural traditions. What I'm saying is that I'm not saying that I will displace and remove the vertical axis and only focus and would like to only focus on the horizontal one. Obviously, in that case, there would be no history, let alone any Armenian history.
Exactly. So the question is, what would this new form look like?
The form would emphasize cultural borrowings and cross-cultural encounters. I gave a couple of examples. I'm not sure how you want me to. In what sense do you want me to give you an embodiment or an example of how this?
Well, I think the key question, just very, very quickly, was these are individual examples cut off from a sort of linear narrative. So how would we actually go vertically by going horizontally? That's the question.
I'm not sure if probably have to think about that, but I don't think going horizontally means avoiding going vertically. I think
obviously, the question is how.
Yeah. Well,
it's not whether.
I can't come up with an example right now, but I can. If I have more time to think about it, I might be able to answer you. But without an example, I can say that a horizontal, let's say, focus. Let's say, in the case of, I can't come up with any examples, but I need more time to think about that.
What about music? What about, say, take Armenian music? That cross-culturally?
Why not?
Yeah, I mean,
I'm not
that
an
seems
expert
to me that
on
would be.
ethnomusicology, but the examples I provided are mostly from areas that I'm familiar with.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, I might get back to you some other time.
First, let's hear and welcome Maud Mandel back to Michigan.
Many thanks for the warm introduction. It's a pleasure to be back in Michigan. I haven't been here since I defended my dissertation in 1998, so it's actually been a very long time. And I'm coming twice this year, once in Armenian studies and once in Jewish history, to recognize turning point moments in both programs. So it feels like old home year for me, and it's really very nice to be able to come back again. I will say I picked the title of this paper. I wrote the title of this paper before I wrote the paper. And once I wrote the paper, it was bigger than the title of the paper. So I am going to talk about what my title says, but I'm going to come to that towards the second half. And you'll see why as we go forward. My instructions today were, as has become clear from listening to other papers, to consider the way new considerations of global, world, and transnational history have created opportunities for rethinking Armenian history. So I'm going to offer my own 2 cents on this particular issue by focusing specifically on the challenge that the new interest in empire and imperial histories has posed to the more narrow focus on genocide and nation-form origins that has so dominated the field. I'm borrowing the word from you. I had nation-state in here, but I like nation-form better, so I put that in. That has so dominated the field of 20th century Armenian history. But I'm going to do this as I do things. That is to say, I'm really, by training and professional hat, a Jewish historian. And so what I would like to do is draw from some of the conclusions and interpretive developments in the field of Jewish history and reflect back on what they offer for the field of Armenian history as well. And I hope in doing this I can offer some beginnings of an answer to the questions that were posed to the first 2 papers, because I'm not sure I think that a global, collective, transnational history is quite as devastating to thinkings of writings, these histories, as was suggested in some of the questions. So perhaps we can talk about that some more as I go forward. So when thinking about how best to accomplish my task today, I first plan to speak about various trends in historical scholarship and particular bodies of work that have posed challenges to the way we think about identities of dispersed peoples who've been victimized by powerful and violent regimes. But previous drafts of this paper ended up sort of frustratingly broad and vague as I talked about a range of scholarship that I thought might not be familiar to today's audience. So I decided instead to ground my discussion on a specific example, and by choosing one text and showing how a focus on transnational and imperial questions challenges us to move beyond its central assumptions, I hope to underscore the potential of the new imperial turn to Jewish and also Armenian history. But who to choose to subject to such a public and withering critique? After all, focusing on one book for a long period of time seemed unfair. So the scholar whose work I finally decided to grapple with today has had a profound impact on my scholarly career, but I've come to see the limitations in her initial analytic assumptions. And if that scholar, if you have not yet figured it out, is me. By looking at some of my own work and raising questions as to its analytic framework, I want to point out the way the imperial challenge, if we can call it that, opens new interpretive avenues for the study of the modern Armenian historical experience that have thus far remained overwhelmingly focused on the history of genocide and nation state. I should just underscore here, I'm really interested, I am a modern historian, and I'm interested in the 19th and 20th centuries when histories of the formation of the nation state of Armenia and the genocides of the 20th century have really loomed quite large. In 2003, I published a book called In the Aftermath of Genocide. We heard about that. This book, which was based on my dissertation, was very much concerned with themes at the heart of historical investigation in these years. The main issue that concerned me was the impact of genocide on survivors, not as individuals, but as communities. So the book's central questions focused on how survivors of genocidal regimes confronted the ideological onslaughts that cast doubt on their place within an international civil society constituted primarily along national lines. And I asked, in what ways, if at all, did such attacks challenge previous held notions of faith, community, solidarity, and national identity? How did survivors assess the feasibility of living as national minorities or diaspora populations after an attack on their status as such? How did they come to terms with transnational identities in a world seemingly determined to define itself along national lines? And I addressed these broad questions through a comparative study of the victims of two 20th century European genocides, the Holocaust and the Armenian genocide. And I particularly focused on these two populations in France, the only Western European nation to provide homes to substantial communities of escapees. I didn't work on the United States. This is not the place to rehearse the conclusions of that book, which you can still buy. It is still in print, so feel free to rush right out and buy a copy. I hope it still has much to tell us about how survivors reconstituted their communities after violent attacks against them. But I'm focusing on this book today as an example of how it reflected key assumptions of the decade in which it was written and how recent interest in empire can productively redirect the questions we ask about both of the groups that interested me in that book. The first way in which I see this book reflecting assumptions of the scholarly agenda of its day was the centrality of genocide to its analytic mission. Although focusing on the history of survivors, and I used to insist vociferously I didn't work on genocide, but on survivors, on the story thereafter, so it was a story of survivors rather than a story of victimization or destruction. The book took genocide to be the defining experience of 20th century Armenian and Jewish history. Now, as such, I reflected assumptions, not unfounded, of both fields that privilege the story of ethno-religious destruction over other historical developments in the modern era. Now, of course, I want to be careful to qualify this point. The historiography on both in the 19th and 20th century is more diverse than this statement suggests. While explaining the origins and ramifications of the Holocaust and Armenian genocide has been a central historical question, it would be a mischaracterization to collapse the rich field of modern Jewish history or Armenian history into this one framework, as we heard today in some of our earlier discussions. And yet, if both historiographies are more developed than a focus on genocide suggests, both certainly have taken a great interest and almost central interest in the violence of the 20th century and has dramatically shaped the analytic agenda. Most notably for my purposes today, if most scholars are careful not to present Armenians or Jews as the perpetual victims of history, what we heard earlier Salo Baron famously called the lacrimonious view of Jewish history, but rather agents of their own historical destiny, there's no question that a focus on genocide has necessarily emphasized the powerlessness and victimness, if I can make up a word, of the two populations in historical framings. I'll come back to this. A second analytic framework at the heart of my analysis was that of the diaspora-homeland divide. When I was writing my dissertation, the term diaspora had come integrated into historical discussions on the nature of difference. As such, its meanings had expanded to encompass a larger semantic domain, including such words as immigrant, refugee, expatriate, etc. In a postmodern moment that celebrated multiculturalism, the term had taken on an almost mythical status to include all transnational identities. In response to this celebration of dispersion, some scholars began emphasizing the significance of an original homeland, either real or as a mythic place of desire, to the process of shaping cohesive and conscious diaspora communities. Armenians and Jews, and Greeks, some argued, were the archetypal diaspora communities not because of their dispersion per se, but because of the way this dispersion was negotiated through engagements with lost homelands. Now, as a historian, what intrigued me about these largely theoretical formulations was the question of what happened to such diaspora communities when the national homeland was brought out of the realm of myth or prayer with the formation of legally constituted, identifiable national states, a transformation that some of the theoretical literature at least tended to blur over a bit. The birth of Israel and the Republic of Armenia provided survivors with options that had previously only seemed feasible to a small minority of idealists and raised new questions about national and transnational allegiances. And what I concluded was that the very consolidation of the nation-state system in the 20th century made the transnational or denationalized status of these survivors untenable. Unable to exist outside of this system, they took part in newly energized nationalist movements which sought to provide space for them, however disconnected from their own settlement plans in the international arena. So while some were arguing that contemporary diaspora groups were emblems of transnationalism because their existence questioned the notion of borders at the heart of the definition of the nation, I argued that Armenian and Jewish survivors in France were actively seeking to end such questions. It was counterintuitive at some level, but by participating in nationalist movements that transcended the borders of the countries in which they lived, they were, of course, encompassing the diaspora homeland divide that interested so many contemporary theorists. It was my argument, however, that these now thriving nationalist discourses served not as a celebration of transnationalism, but rather as proof of the power of the national idiom. Okay, so it should be pretty clear from this brief overview that the nation-state stood at the heart of my analysis. This is not particularly surprising given the moment of my historical training. While the constructed nature of national movements and an interest in border crossings shaped my doctoral generation, those working in Jewish history and the smaller number working on Armenian diaspora communities after World War I, which was a considerably smaller field, were most interested in the broad question of minority integration into the state. And I'm not going to take time here to review Jewish historiography, but suffice it to say that the driving question of late 20th century scholarship on the modern Jewish experience dealt with this issue of Jewish integration of the state. How much did Jews assimilate? How much did they maintain their ethnic cohesion? And this perspective led me to see Armenian and Jewish genocide survivors first and foremost as ethnic subgroups responding to genocide always in the context of the wider national structure, in my case, France. Their diaspora and post-genocidal histories thus became subordinate, in my analysis, to their status as ethnic minorities in the wider French nation-state. So for the remainder of my time today, I would like to consider how the imperial turn has begun to radically focus my own scholarly agenda away from the topics that so interested me 15 years ago, by focusing on some examples from the field of Jewish history, which has embraced the imperial turn, I think, even more aggressively than the field of Armenian history, again, particularly for the 2 centuries that I'm addressing today. And I want to focus specifically on how this work has made me rethink historical causality. I will actually speak a little bit here about the genocide, even though I'm talking about being pushed away from focusing on genocide, but I think it even has pretty substantial implications for how we think about genocide as well as broader issues of historical agency and victimization that displaces or at least de-emphasizes the centrality of genocide as the analytic framework for conceptualizing these two ethnic histories. And I will conclude with a consideration of how the imperial turn refocuses the discussion on diaspora identity in more productive ways, displacing the centrality of the homeland diaspora binary and re-emphasizing dispersion and ethnic links as the most analytically revealing aspects of modern Armenian history. So first to the question of genocide. So first a qualification. I don't mean to downplay in this discussion the centrality of genocide. In defining the 20th century historical development of Jewish and Armenian communities. It would be inaccurate and revisionist to the point of historical absurdity. But I hope to suggest that a myopic concern with genocide has unintended consequences, focusing us too heavily on the end of something, Armenian life in Anatolia, rather than on the longer-term historical development of the Armenian people. Genocide was part of that history, not its end. And on the other hand, overemphasizing the Armenian and Jew as victim. A wider imperial lens challenges both assumptions. In emerging scholarships on Jews and empire, a field which I must say is also in its infancy, the relationship between the dominant and the dominated has been of central concern. One of the most significant aspects of the imperial turn in Jewish history has been to challenge once again, but in the most definitive of ways, the lachrymose fantasy, victimization, by interrogating the illusion of an absolute binary between power and powerlessness. How Jews have exercised power within the context of empire has become an increasingly central question of concern as scholars begin to explore the role of Jews at the seam of imperial adventures and colonial ideologies. Whereas previous scholarship long resisted thinking of Jews either as agents within imperial histories due to anti-Semitic discourses about Jews and power, and polemics around the history of Zionism, new work has called for a reconceptualization of the problem. And here I quote Ivan Kalmar and Derek Penslew, who asserted in 2005 that because of the links between empire and the array of supranational economic and political networks so central to anti-Semitic fantasies, quote, scholars in Jewish studies have been hesitant to probe what reality might lie behind the myth. And yet they contend, quote, scholars in Jewish studies must confront the realities of Jewish power and learn to distinguish between it in its various forms. New scholarship has taken up the charge, demonstrating, for example, how so-called port Jews formed crucial components of imperial economies, and tracing how many others found their communities reframed by imperial conquests that created or disrupted commonalities of language, cuisine, custom, liturgy, and culture. In the modern era, the thing that interests me most today, Jews often occupied a space between empire and nation. For those ranging from state actors to writers and philosophers, many in the French and German empires, for example, appeared as at once embodiments of the Oriental or the other at the empire's edge, and as particularly attractive agents, and this is true in Armenian history as well, for allegedly civilizing processes of European conquest and transformation. Subsequently, many of the same Jews lent their vocal support to the colonial projects of the mother country as ways to support their own quest for emancipation and equality. As such an argument suggests, a focus on empire calls for a paradigm shift that continues to see Jews as victims of 19th and 20th century history. The project of empire, we have learned, is mutually constitutive. For much of this work, empire is a project made by its subjects within specific cultural domains. That such projects have, to a greater or lesser degree, depended on the participation and even complicity of those subjects is not to deny that power asymmetries were real. It is, however, to suggest that power is not a matter of politics alone. Symbols, language, clothing, and other examples function within a discursive realm that simultaneously reflects and contests domination. So I'm going to just draw on one example here to help me make this point. In her recent book, Plumes, Sarah Stein traces the short-lived trade in ostrich feathers at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. This global supply network that once reached from the Cape Colony and the Mediterranean to the European colonies, European capitals, with London at the epicenter and onto the United States, was propelled by Jews. Lithuanian immigrants in South Africa and Sephardic traders in North Africa sold the feathers to predominantly Jewish feather manufacturers in London, New York, and Paris, who in turn employed immigrant Jewish girls and women from Eastern Europe to fashion the plumes into hats, ornaments, fans, boas, and dress trimmings. Stein traces this market from its height to its collapse on the eve of the First World War, showing how links between imperial policy and social realities in the Russian and British empires, the complex social and economic constitution of colonial Africa, the importance of growing global transatlantic and colonial trade, and the whims and politics of women's fashion allowed a particular group of Jews to become central players in this specific commodity growth and development. Stein's focus on Jews and international commerce are significant for us today. What do we learn if we investigate what qualifies as a bona fide Jewish global trade monopoly? Stein is at pains to demonstrate that Jews did not succeed in the ostrich feather trade simply because they were Jews. Sub-ethnic distinctions mattered. The Sephardim had dramatically less success than did the Ashkenazi in the Cape Colony feather market, just as the Ashkenazi hardly cracked the North and West African trade. So too did feather fluency count. Some who were more skilled than others did better in feather grading. But at the end, she argues, Jewishness was, quote, the glue that bound together a global market. From the closed feather markets of London to buyers' cartels that kept farmers' prices low, the players in the feather game enjoyed cozy relationships that tended to enforce Jewish hegemony. Despite silence on the topic by historians of modern Jewry, she argues, Jews facilitated the creation of capitalist networks in the colonies that served consumers in Europe's and America's metropoles. Jewish feather traders were not passive vectors through which European capital was invested, but were intricately situated in the economic relations of colonial Southern Africa and Imperial Europe. The promise or challenge for Armenian history in such formulation is as profound as it has begun to be in Jewish history. If one accepts, as Sarah Stein has suggested elsewhere, that the Russian and Ottoman empires were imperial polities comparable to, if in certain critical respects distinct from, the early modern Dutch Empire and the modern British and French empires, then it's not difficult to see how policies in imperial borderlands rippled through these societies to be felt both acutely by Armenians and Jews. Scholars of the Russian and Ottoman empires have begun to stress the centrality of multi-ethnicity, multilingualism, and multi-sectarianism to the history and experience of empire, i.e. imperial diversity, and yet the assumption that the Russian or Ottoman empires were imperial polities on par with other modern European overseas empires is a relatively new one, although I would say growing in recent years, and thought that their borderlands might be understood as colonies, yet somewhat controversial. The connections and overlap between these phenomena have not been explored fully by scholars of Armenian history, rendering yet tangential any theoretical and historical insight offered by recent scholarship on empire. It's my contention, however, that the recent insights gleaned about Jews in such setting hold out promise for conceptualizations of Armenian agency in the Ottoman and Russian empires, allowing us on the one hand to rethink Armenian subjectivity in the multi-ethnic, heterogeneous empires in which they found themselves. Excuse me, very dramatic, where they, like Jews, played a crucial role in the imperial economy. And in fact, it's interesting, we were talking earlier about trade in the Ottoman Empire, and you were saying there's not much history written or even very clear about active trade networks here. And yet if you read Jewish history, there is a very strong assertion that Armenians displaced Jews in the Ottoman Empire as the central sort of trade networks, and it's one of the reasons Jews ended up doing so well, because they were in fact displaced and not very important by the time we get to the 19th century. So that's clearly a problem in juggling these two fields. A focus on Armenians as agents in imperial adventures in no way undermines an analysis that points to their minority and often despised religious status in an Islamic empire, but it also reminds of the multiple factors, aside from religion, that shape the historical development of Armenians in wider imperial structures. And this is really what's most interesting to me, displaces the us-them focus that can often shape historical writing that takes genocide as its jumping-off point. Moreover, a focus on imperial borderlands also forces us to rethink causalities for genocide itself. And here I'll just briefly mention Timothy Snyder's new book, Bloodlands, which is suggestive of the wider point that I am stressing. I have no time to explore the arguments of this complex and important work, nor its very real distortions that scholars like Richard Evans and Omar Bartov have noted aggressively. But it has challenged the historiography on the Holocaust in profound and significant ways, with implications, I would say, for the study of the Armenian genocide as well. Focusing on the place where the most of the Second World War's bloodshed occurred, the Eastern borderlands, Eastern European borderlands between the Nazi state and the Soviet Union, Snyder argues that the 14 million men, women, and children murdered from 1933, and note the number, 14 million, from 1933 to 45 in this region by both Hitler and Stalin, must be understood as victims of one cataclysmic event. By looking at the violent collectivization in the Ukraine under Stalin to Hitler's ethnic cleansing of Slavs, Gypsies, and Jews as mutually constitutive, Snyder does not downplay ideological obsessions with killing Jews, but he reminds us that its scope, the scope of the Holocaust, was necessarily the product of the struggle for territory between the Soviet and Nazi empires, the, quote, battlefield on which their imperial reach was contested and demarcated. I don't have time today to talk at length about his argument, but I just will note that in conceding the centrality of anti-Semitism as the ideological backdrop that allowed mass murder to take place, Snyder places equal emphasis on a whole series of preconditions that involve not one or two, but three different occupations, and most notably, German occupation in its harsh Eastern form, Soviet power, and the way it violently transformed the region, even prior to Nazi occupation. Now, the Armenian genocide, of course, cannot be reduced to the same origins and explanations. However, a focus on imperial struggles, in this case, too, does remind us of the way that combustible combinations of territorial borderlands and war led to the 20th century to unprecedented bloodshed. And I think here of the recent book by Steve McQueen, The Berlin-Baghdad Express, The Ottoman Empire and Germany's Bid for World Power, which refocuses explanations for the violence against Armenians on the Russian, German, and Ottoman struggle for control of eastern Anatolia and the significance of completing the railroad in that region, allowing the Ottoman-German alliance to wage its war and facilitating the deportation of local Armenians viewed as a threat by Ottoman authorities in their struggle. Now, McMean's interpretation is hardly groundbreaking. Scholars of the genocide have dismissed Ottoman claims that Armenians were a security threat in the region as justification for their murderous plans. But his emphasis on long-standing German-Ottoman cooperation to build the railroad and on ongoing threats of Russians in the regions reminds that geography mattered. And again, I emphasize this, that binary explanations that root genocide in the ideological divisions between Muslim and Christian or Armenian and Turk too myopically write out the wider structure in which such divisions became violent, or at least they problematize the explanations for immediate causality. In McMeekin's account, Armenians were clearly victims of a violent attack against them, but they were also historical subjects seeking to use whatever resources were available to them to save themselves, and while war was the causal spark for the massacres, the struggle over control of imperial borderlands, he implies, like Snyder, and this is where there's a similarity, created tensions. In other words, not only intensifying tensions that were there, but made new ones that became embedded in the region throughout the preceding century, but were made anew and help us understand why then and there. The implications for such analyses, if only suggestive in McMeekin's work, are profound, since they force us to ask how imperial policies and war not only ignited long-standing ethnic divisions, but created them, helping to explain why previously convivial populations became increasingly polarized over the end of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They force a reconsideration of 19th century Armenian history in Anatolia through the lens of interactions of peoples, indigenous populations, and the regimes that sought to control them. I think such an approach would help explain, in a way that, at least so far to me, the history has not well explained, the role, for example, of Kurds in the genocide, which is often mentioned in passing and really never adequately explained. I don't have the answer to this in any way, but I'm quite convinced that the theories we have so far to explain this are entirely inadequate. And I have a feeling the answer lies in imperial borderland struggles in ways of empowering the Kurds through Russian and Ottoman control. But I don't know. I'm not an Ottomanist, so it's just a guess. But what I do know is the answer has not yet been clearly spelled out. Okay, moving on. The imperial turn has done more than challenge us to rethink the origins of genocide and return subjectivity to some of its victims. New scholarship, now I'm getting to the title of my paper, new scholarship in the arena raises fundamental questions about the diaspora-homeland relationship that so interested those of us studying Jews and Armenians in the early 1990s. As I noted, the effort to define and delineate the meaning of diaspora identification in the history of these dispersed populations brought scholars, myself included, to focus on the significance of an original homeland, either mythical or real, to the constitution of our diaspora identities. Put another way, what made diasporas analytically interesting was their relation to a state, real or imagined. The journal Diaspora, whose wonderful editor sits amidst us today, and I hope he'll forgive me for suggesting some rethinking of the framing of what is a terrific journal, defined its mission in its initial introductory essay, tellingly entitled The Nation State and Its Others, as studying, quote, the infranational and transnational others of the nation state. Studying those who challenged national borders, thus also told us something about nation states. To quote Khachig, Diasporas are emblems of transnationalism because they embody the questions of borders, which is at the heart of any adequate definition of the others of the nation state. That's a very long quote, but I'm going to end it there. I can tell you more about that justification if you're interested. What strikes me now, I'm going to read it again though. Diasporas are emblems of transnationalism because they embody the questions of borders, which is at the heart of any adequate definition of the others of the nation state. What strikes me now in reading these words and in analyzing my own interest in diasporas and homelands is the way the focus on diaspora identity as we conceptualized it, while driven by its interest in border crossings, subtly reified the nation as an analytic category. And far be it from me, a historian of France, to suggest that a focus on the all-powerful nation-state should not continue to be a significant point of departure for historical scholarship on the 19th and 20th centuries. My point is only that there's a certain irony that in studying diaspora as a category for challenging the nation, we threw the analytic lens back on the nation. The imperial turn, I would suggest, offers a way out of this conundrum by refocusing us on the dispersion that stood at the heart of the Jewish and Armenian historical experience and the way that influenced their sense of groupness. Indeed, the very assertion that diaspora identity challenges the boundaries of the nations emphasizes a form of belonging that did not characterize the political status of most Armenians and Jews throughout history. And while Hachi was quite right when he wrote elsewhere in that essay I already cited that the rise of the triumphant nation-state challenged the meaning of those dispersions as new polities claimed legitimacy by asserting their right to represent homogeneous peoples in a united territory and under one rule of law, it is also true that for the greater parts of the historical experience of Armenians and Jews, dispersion throughout and across empires is what defined them. Without discounting the centrality of Armenia or the land of Israel to group consciousness in the long histories of the two populations under discussion, I fear that the focus on homeland and nation-state has overemphasized this aspect of communal linkages over the way dispersion in large multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and polyglot empires define the Armenian and Jewish historical experiences. If both Armenian and Jewish culture claimed an ancient homeland and kingdom and looked back nostalgically to a golden age of great kings, saints, sages, and poets, and yearned to return to ancient capitals with sacred sites and buildings, it's also true that these polyglot and multi-skilled trading communities moved across the Middle East and Europe using the networks of enclave of their religionists to compete with each other and other ethnic networks and use their wealth, education, and economic skills to overset their political powerlessness. And I would argue here that Sarah Stein's work of Ostrich Feathers is again instructive. In tracing the ethnic trading network from South Africa to London to New York, operating, by the way, if you read Stein's book, you'll see she's writing about the height of the rise of the nation state. She's not talking about early modern trading communities or port Jews. She's talking about the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Stein shows how for those Jews in the business, notions of Jewishness became defined by the trade in which they were engaged. Consumption of ostrich feathers, she points out, like the consumption of diamonds, women, and liquor, depended on contact between gendered consumers in the metropole and Jewish merchants in home and colonial markets and beyond. And these relationships in turn fueled cultural assumptions about Jews' rootlessness and their inseparability from the portable, ephemeral, and luxury goods so central to the modern experience. At the same time, she argues, the meaning of Jewish may have been to some extent contingent on vocational choice in the turn-of-century South African context. And one question she raises really provocatively is whether working in the feather trade allowed Jewish men and their families, seemingly regardless of the extent of their success, to exploit certain benefits of whiteness denied to Jews in other industries and commercial pursuits. So her conclusions only tell us something about Lithuanian Jews, and this is important, it's not about all Jews, involved in this particular commodity chain, but they suggest the way trading networks that traversed linguistic, political, and oceanic divides linked modern diaspora and imperial ambitions to create new meanings of communal identity. For these Lithuanian Jews, nation-states mattered less than international trade, dispersion, and imperial subjecthood. I suspect the same is true for most Armenians and Jews living in the Ottoman Empire, and Russian empires beyond, regardless of what dreams, sort of communal dreams, were linked to some notion of nationhood. or peoplehood. My conclusions today can only be suggestive. The field of Jews and empire is too nascent to draw far-reaching parallels to the Armenian experience, and it's certainly not identical in any way or shape or form. So one can't make dramatic declarations about the rewriting of historiographies so fundamentally shaped by their focus on the nation-state. I would, however, argue that by using the imperial return to rethink the long sweep of Armenian history, but particularly for the 19th and 20th centuries, we'll be forced to move away from 20th century tragedies and the origins of national identity and reassess basic categories of analysis such as periodization, identity, and subjectivity. While most of modern history is being reconsidered through the lens of empire, one could argue that Armenian and Jewish history has been defined by the category much more so than most. It's time for scholars to take advantage of this new lens and catch up with the history of those they study.
Okay, Michael. Take a deep breath, everybody.
Well, first, I just want to thank the Armenian Studies Department for organizing the symposium today, and also all of you for coming, obviously. If we examine the Armenian communities which pepper the planet everywhere from London to Beirut, from Guatemala to Calcutta, from Isfahan to Detroit, we find, not surprisingly, that one of the most ubiquitous folk songs across these far-flung communities takes dislocation from a real or imagined center as its subject. The song, titled Gurung, or Crane, opens with the mournful cry of a wanderer, far from his or her homeland, who notices the slender white body of a crane passing overhead. Crane, the wanderer implores throughout the song's famous refrain, "Whence do you come? Don't you have any news of our land?" Although the wanderer takes a moment to ponder if the crane is coming or going from Baghdad, or whether the crane will nest in Aleppo or elsewhere, all speculation over the bird's migratory route remains fruitless. In the end, the Armenian learns nothing about home, and the great bird disappears over another foreign horizon. The anonymous Armenian's now famous invocation, "Crane, whence do you come?" may have no news to depart about its origin, but perhaps origins should not concern us much here. As Derrida put it, quote, "The painful desire to return to a single and authentic origin," end quote, is a specter which haunts not only Western continental philosophy, but in both direct and tangential ways, sometimes Armenian studies as well. New technologies have only made this specter more visible. Take, for example, the recent slandering on YouTube of the Armenian Studies program at the University of Michigan as the awkwardly and I think amusingly titled False School of Armenological Studies. Because our faculty do not maintain there is an uninterrupted continuity between the modern-day Armenians and the ancient population of Urartu almost 3,000 years ago. Visibility is not the same as credibility, however, and often what seems most readily visible belies the more interesting ways in which Armenians are, and have always been, interconnected and co-constitutive with the peoples and planet around them, whether during the Middle Ages, early modern period, or in the context of modern globalization, as we have seen in the astute presentations today. The importance of the question, "Crane, whence do you come?" is that it cannot be answered in terms of origins, not by one lone Armenian, one single community, or even one gathering of academics and scholars, for the simple reason that we don't know a singular origin of the song. Instead, I have chosen to adopt the wanderer's question as my own, because it offers a valuable double perspective into early modern and modern Armenian cultural production. On one hand, the history of the crane reveals a purposeful configuration over time of a significant political and cultural symbol for the spread of Armenian communities across the globe. The crane provides a counterweight to the overwrought image of the twin peaks of Mount Ararat, which stands as a synecdoche for homeland lost and the supposedly homogeneous cultural experience that was shared there. Whereas Ararat exists symbolically as a center just out of reach, the crane represents dispersion, life on the periphery, the linguistic and historical particularities of local experience. This is one story I will attempt to tease out in the history of the Armenian crane. On the other hand, if we want to take the question of whence the crane seriously, we cannot confine our search exclusively to the realm of Armenian discourse. Although, and this is a point that bears stressing, the last century of Armenian discourse on the crane has implicitly discouraged thinking of the gurung as anything other than uniquely, distinctly Armenian. Consequently, in examining the history of how the crane came to be articulated in an Armenian idiom, I will also ask the broader question of how that history, in fact, eclipses broader regional interconnection and possibilities of global interaction with other governments, cultures, and literatures. To tell the strange history of the gurung, we will begin by tracing its flight backwards in time. And I should note that there's actually quite a good book about this by Shushanik Nazarian, published in 1980 in Yerevan on basically the print history of the gurung. So if you want a more complete picture, please consult that. The latest discursive space which the Armenian crane occupies has not been literary, but rather technological. During a parade last month celebrating the 20th anniversary of the independence of Armenia, the military publicly unveiled the first Armenian-made drones. These unmanned aerial vehicles are remotely operated and can seek out enemy targets at great distances from centers of military command. For this reason, they not surprisingly bear the name gurung. Yeah, collective groan. Likewise, the crane tells another story of urban development in the capital of Armenia, as mechanical cranes, or ampartsi gurung ner, have punctuated the Yerevan skyline for the past decade, creaking and turning against the backdrop of a vibrant, if not sometimes gentrified, city. The last 25 years have likewise witnessed the birth of two separate political movements, which have both chosen to name themselves after the gurung. And it is especially significant that both movements did so because the crane represents the longing to reclaim or return to one's homeland. The most recent of these movements, as our own Professor Suni has noted, was a group of Georgian Armenians, which occasionally lent its support to Abkhazian separatist movements from the Georgian state. The other organization, of course, which named itself Gurung, was in no way incidental to the development of the modern Armenian Republic or the early course that it took, but rather formed in Karabakh after the Karabakh movement had already gained popular support in Armenia during the tumultuous year of 1988. Thomas de Waal reminds us that Robert Kocharian oversaw Gurung's ideological section, and overall he argues that Gurung, quote, was the first organization in Gorbachev's Soviet Union to use the strike as a political weapon, end quote. The underpinning of the crane's political dimension also are present in its various cultural manifestations. Gurung is an electronic newspaper which always bears news from your land, wherever that might be. A dance performed by various Armenian cultural groups around the world. A site of reinterpretation, even purification, of Armenian culture, such as in the recent popular Armenian a cappella album, Notes to a Crane, by the group Zulal, which means limpid or clear, as though the rough edges of folk music can be hewn away by beautiful, crystalline voices. In short, the crane has acted as the rallying point for various ideological and cultural projects, but also in the case of Zulal and Armenian dance troupes, it has served the function of publicly showcasing the authenticity of Armenian culture. We might ask why the symbol of the crane is so prominent in both the Republic of Armenia and in various diasporic communities. To answer that question, we must follow the crane back to the beginning of the 20th century and to the end of the 19th. In 1915, for example, Father Grigoris Balakian reported in his gruesome memoirs that young men sang gurung while marching to their deaths in the desert during the final crumbling days of the Ottoman Empire. Crane, whence do you come? The young man sang together, eventually concluding collectively, I will die as a wanderer. Balakian wondered in his memoirs, quote, whether the homesick Armenian poet when he wrote these lines, had even imagined such a black and bloody day, when the entire Armenian population would die as exiles in the deserts of Deir Zor, without bread, without water, and without a grave. For Balakian, the author of Gurung was nothing short of a prophet of near biblical proportions, to be capable of imagining such an apocalyptic and genocidal modernity. Yet the Armenian intelligentsia had arguably adopted the crane as a symbol of the dispersion of the Armenian race only several decades earlier. While studying to become a doctor in Europe, for example, in the first decade of the 20th century, Rupen Sevouh penned his famous essay, Gurung, in which he described singing the song over the corpse of an anonymous Armenian whom he had been unable to save from tuberculosis. He noted that the song, Gurung, was known, quote, from every corner of the world, from every chamber of every heart, end quote, for the simple reason that, quote, on the roads of exile, an entire people was dying anonymously, end quote. For Sevouh, Gurung was a song that, again, quote, contained enough grief to poison the entire world and enough sweetness to make the stones weep, end quote. At the same time, the young poet Daniel Varoujan was also studying abroad in Ghent, where he published a poem, The Old Crane, in a book of poetry he titled The Heart of the Race. In the poem, Varoujan mourns over the tired, skeletal body of an old crane. Nearing death, the old bird shivers with, quote, the wounds of an exiled nation, end quote, and is unable to deliver all the kisses, prayers, and news from home that weighed down its wings for so many years. The poem concludes with the enemy of the crane, the Ottoman Empire, slowly encircling the crane's neck in the form of a snake. For Varoujan, and arguably for those who mobilized the symbolic crane for various ends in the century which followed, the crane represented more than just the category of exile per se. It represented the distinctly unique exile of the Armenians, not only in national terms, but most significantly in immutable and racial ones. The Mokhitarist congregation of Armenian Catholics on the island of San Lazaro, which first printed Gurung in 1843 as part of an ongoing series on animals in their journal Basmaveb, had no such racial aspirations for the crane. Although Gurung later appeared in Alishan's Book of Popular Armenian Songs, the Mokhitarists, those staunch champions of classical Armenian, did not even consider Gurung to be serious literature, as it was written in the vernacular and furthermore mixed with a smattering of loanwords in Arabic, Turkish, and Persian. The author of the entry on the crane did not even consider the bird to be uniquely Armenian or representative of Armenian dispersion, but instead observed that, quote, as people of Eastern nations, who, when taking leave of their homelands, would not be able to hear one bit of news from their country or parents or relatives for years, would see the crane calling out as it flew overhead and crossed distant lands, they devised songs on the crane with burning hearts, end quote. For the Mokhitarists, Gurung represented a phenomenon that was indigenous to the entire Near East. The Mokhitarists additionally noted that the oldest known version of the song comes from a 17th century manuscript from the Near East. But precisely where the paper trail leaves off in Armenian, it picks up in a variety of other Near Eastern and even European languages and literatures. For example, Abd al-Ghani al-Nablusi, a well-known Sufi who lived in Aleppo during the 17th century, wrote in a manual on the interpretation of dreams that to see a crane in one's sleep meant that one was fated to wander in another country, destitute and forlorn. In 20th century Punjabi poetry and folk songs, the crane, or kunj, often represents a single wanderer who has become separated from his flock, a destitute person far from home. As we have seen in the Armenian case, this literary device symbolically couples the figure of the crane with exile and dispersion. Similar patterns can be found elsewhere in northwest India and Pakistan. Again, just like the Armenian Gurung, the metaphoric pairing of the crane with dispersion developed not only generally as a literary representation of migration, travel, and immigration during the early modern period, but also developed specifically to comment on the dispersion of particular groups of people. In Dogri, for example, one such traditional folk song uses the figure of the traveling crane, the kunj, to survey the dispersion of Dogri-speaking communities lyrically throughout northern India. My point here is not simply to observe that the crane exists as an exilic motif throughout the Middle East and India, which would ultimately amount to nothing more than the celebration of a watered-down and consequently meaningless multiculturalism. Neither do I wish to argue for a model of direct influences between speakers of Arabic, Armenian, Urdu, Punjabi, Dogri, and other languages, which at best would be another attempt to get back at the origins of a literary symbol and confirm the authenticity of any one crane over all the others. For, while there arguably existed a broader semiotic connection between cranes and dispersion across the Middle East and India, the semiotics of dispersion do not necessarily need to have developed exclusively from popular songs or from literature. Cranes have some of the longest migratory routes of any animal. These birds literally create thousands of miles of cross-continental biological traffic every year. It isn't hard to see why the crane appealed to so many peoples as a symbol of travel and immigration, although the fact that this particular usage of the crane had currency among multiple groups within a broad region suggests that the symbol didn't spring up coincidentally as a fully formed paradigm in each language either. What matters, I would argue, is not really that the symbolic crane also existed in Armenian, but rather how Armenian authors and intellectuals responded to that multinational crane, what they decided to do with it. Sebouh, Varujan, and Balakian, to name only a few among many, each read the crane as though it were an inkblot test for the experiences of the modern Armenian people and a signifier of the forces which had scattered Armenians across the globe.